Good morning. Can I welcome everybody to today's meeting of the Budget and Performance Committee. In accordance with government regulations, we're holding this meeting on a virtual basis, with Assembly members and guests participating remotely. In accordance with Standing Order 8.2, I have invited Assembly member Navin Shah to attend this meeting and participate in the discussion with invited guests at item 6. I will call Assembly members to speak by name during the question and answer session, and I will also introduce each guest as they join us. Our main discussion today will be on the 2021-22 GLA Core budget. Everyone is encouraged to take part in the discussion on social media using the hashtag AssemblyBudget. Can I start by asking our clerk, Fiona Bywaters, to confirm the names of Assembly members who are present at this meeting and any apologies for absence?
Good morning, Chairman. I've received no apologies for absence. So present on the call we have Assembly members Sian Berry, Umesh Desai, Tony Devenish, Dr. Alison Moore, Caroline Pigeon MBE, Dr. Onkar Sahota, Deputy Chair Len Duval, yourself as Chairman Susan Hall, and Observer Navin Shah.
Thank you, Fiona. Could I ask everyone to check that their electronic devices are switched to silent to avoid any interruptions, and that during our question and answer session, microphones are set to mute until you are called to speak. Okay, are there any declarations of interest or any others, and can we note the list of declarations in the report?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we confirm the minutes of the meetings held on the 10th of December 2020, the 16th of December 2020, and the 5th of January 2021 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you. The committee will see that, appendices 5A, 8 and 9 to item 4 concerning confidential correspondence have been provided to members only and are reserved from publication for the reasons set out in the agenda. Should members wish to discuss the content of those appendices, we will need to resolve to exclude the press and the public from the meeting, and I would suggest that we do so at the end of the meeting. If members do not wish to discuss the content of those appendices, then I will simply ask the committee to confirm the exclusion of appendices 5A and 8 and 9 from publication. Do members wish to discuss the exempt appendices? No. Okay, thank you. Can I therefore ask the committee to confirm that pursuant to Schedule 12A of the Local Government Act, the information set out at Agenda 4B should be excluded from publications on the ground that it involves the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined by paragraph 3, Schedule 12A to the Local Government Act 1972, and it is considered that in all circumstances of the case, the public interest in maintaining the exemption outweighs the public interest in disclosing the information, and also to note the information set out. Can we also note the completed, closed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the committee? Yes?
Yes.
Thank you. And can we note the action, I'm going on now, actions taken under delegated authority. Can we note the action taken by me as chairman under delegated authority in consultation party group lead members and Caroline Pigeon AM to agree the committee outputs listed in appendices 1 to 5? Thank you. Can we also note the relevant responses received from the Chief of Staff at Appendix 6 and the Mayor at Appendix 7? Finally, can we also delegate authority to myself as chairman in consultation with party group leaders and Caroline Pigeon AM to agree a further response to the Mayor on the 2021-22 GLA Group budget consultation?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you. An awful lot that we've been through there. Well, thank you very much. So that brings us to today's main item of business, which is the 2021-22 GLA Core budget review. The following guests are in attendance for today's meeting, and I welcome David Bellamy, who is the Mayor's Chief of Staff for the GLA, Mary Hartley, Chief Officer for the GLA, and also David Galley, Executive Director of Resources for the GLA. I understand that Executive Directors are also present on the call, should they be required for any detailed response at my indication. So that brings us to today's business. So good morning, everybody. If I can start, I'll start with you, David Bellamy, if I may. How and why did you decide to allocate funding to each recovery mission?
Good morning, Chair, committee members. Obviously, the allocations are there and fairly similar to the ones set out in the draft budget, and it was a case of trying to look at the different areas and understand where the GLA could best make a contribution to London's recovery, both through the individual missions as agreed with the Recovery Board and discussions with partners there as a collective effort, or the foundations, the areas that are more traditional GLA responsibilities. And so it's really based on a balancing act in terms of where we thought we could most make a difference. Okay,
I'm going to be asking you some questions on variations of that, but to start with, can I ask you if Mayor Sadiq Khan comes back as the mayor next time, is the next term going to allocate to recovery missions again, or will we go back to what we would call a normal budget?
So the intention absolutely is to maintain this approach. Obviously what the budget documents do is they show the allocations against the GLA's organisational structure as well, and so you've got that particularly in Appendix A and Appendix B, which both provides that comparison against previous years, and for those who prefer to look at it in those terms, it's set out on that basis.
Okay, I don't know about others, I would find that disappointing, but that's how we are. Okay, regarding the equality, diversity and inclusion mission fundings, does the Mayor really feel he achieves the right balance by spending over half of the £2 million mission budget on his controversial Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm?
Yes.
He does. Right, okay. I mean, if you compare the 1.1 million to the Commission, that the Commission will receive, with the mere 26,000 the Mayor is giving the London Music Fund, which supports children from disadvantaged families learn how to play an instrument and tackles head-on issues of the lack of opportunity of such things, doesn't the Commission funding look even more like virtue signalling when put beside something so practical and that is getting such a small amount of money?
Not at all. I'll allow executive directors to expand on the purpose of that funding, but in terms of the London Music Fund, what I would say is, firstly, it's a great organisation, and secondly, the Mayor's support for it as patron is more than just the financial. It is, for example, the annual lunch that he's attended every year for his mayoralty, which raises very significant funds for the charity, and it's a wonderful charity that I know he's very proud to support.
Yes, no, it is a wonderful charity, and money, I would say personally, is well spent. Unlike the £1.1 million on the so-called Diversity Commission. The Mayor funded the Commission via MD 2689 with 250,000 last year, and data that we've had from the GLA Finance suggests the planned spend was actually 500,000. He's now planning the 1.1 million of funding for 21-22. Do you think he was deliberately misleading Londoners when he said at NQT last month there has been no cost for the Commission and its work?
So he's right that the Commission is commissioners are unpaid, and so there is no cost associated with them. I'll leave colleagues to comment on the costs around supporting activities.
Okay. At this point, does anybody else want to come in under the Diversity Commission?
Yes, please, Chair. I would love to come in. Good morning, David.
Morning, Assembly Member.
In terms of the vetting of this very controversial commission, how much does that cost Londoners?
I don't believe it would have cost anything.
Well, when one of them had to resign because of appalling opinions, do you not think that vetting has got to be a huge part of having such a commission?
it's an interesting question, Assembly Member, and it's one I'm going to review. There are. If I'm sure Assistant Director for HR will with us this morning, she would comment on some of the legal constraints around vetting processes. But that is a matter that I've undertaken to go away and review and see if there are any improvements to the authority's practices that can be introduced.
Thank you. So will you confirm that you will write to the committee with how much it has cost or going forward will cost to vet such committees?
Well, I can tell you now that there is no cost associated with vetting as it happens. If there are changes, it's important to remember that the Commission was appointed entirely in accordance with the published procedures for how mayoral appointments are made. It's a very detailed document that sets that out, and obviously if there are any changes to that, it's a public document, and so yes, we'll publish it.
But surely you would agree that any such public appointment would, and you'd be saying this if this was the government, one of their appointment panels, if people have appalling views, for example.
Chair, indeed, and what I would say is that this appointment process followed the processes that are set out for these things, which in fact we inherited from the previous administration. I don't believe we've changed them, and so I think it is timely to have a review of them, and that's what I intend to do.
Great. I look forward to seeing your letter, David. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. I think we'd all agree that unpaid doesn't mean no cost, and very many of us are very upset by this commission and the amount of taxpayers' money that's going into it. What does the £840,000 being spent on, and I'm quoting, an expanded community engagement programme and team mean in practice, and what will that involve?
Okay, I'll defer to the relevant executive directors who are leading that programme.
Right, who's going to answer?
Thank you. I'm Chair. Thank you very much. The community engagement programme that is being expanded to support the recovery programme is in order for the whole of the recovery programme to be fully engaged with and founded on the views of a very diverse range of Londoners. So to give you some examples of how we will be doing that, part of it will be using the existing Talk London platform, which has just been relaunched and sort of expanded. That gives one mechanism for Londoners to have a voice and to respond to the direction of travel that the recovery programme is going into, and there are sort of regular ways in which the recovery board and the task force hear those insights that have been sort of gathered through the Talk London platform and use them in their discussions. There will also be an investment in some proactive community engagement work, because we know that not all Londoners will be able to access or willing to access sort of an online platform. So we're also going to be designing much more proactive ways of going out into communities and talking to them about the priorities of the recovery programme, so that we can create a feedback loop, so that we can discuss and engage them and use those sort of insights to help us to shape and adapt the recovery programme.
Okay. So if any of the public wanted to look and see how you were spending that £840,000, where would they go to? What website? Where could I direct anybody watching this to look to see how you're spending that £840,000?
There will be, as we go through, so we're at an early stage of development for this community engagement work, as you would imagine at this stage. As we go through, we will make sure that there are, as you say, it is very clear what the plans are in place for the different strands of community engagement, so that it's very sort of clear what opportunities there are for people to get involved and to be part of it.
Okay, my point more being those of us that have to scrutinise what happens to taxpayers' money, which is all of this, we really need transparency on where we can go and look to see if we consider that our money is being spent well. So perhaps at some point we could establish where we go to see where lots of pots of money are going. But thank you, Ms. Khan.
Assist you with that. We of course provide quarterly monitoring reports detailing progress on expenditure to the committee, and the committee, as it is doing now, is quite able to scrutinise officers and ask questions and find things out. We'll obviously, there's a great deal of information published about the Recovery Board and the task force and all its work, and we absolutely intend to continue that and be transparent. It is always inevitably the case that colleagues will have questions that are not covered in documents, and that's why we have these meetings, in order that you can ask them.
Yes, when we are given information, we can ask about various sums of money that we haven't had sight of. Thank you. When the Mayor received his February windfall, he directed £5 million into funding to drive people back to the central activity zone once COVID-19 is hopefully well and truly under control. So what sort of initiatives will this work entail? David?
That's probably a question for Phil Graham, who's been leading that work.
Okay, then briefly, Phil. Mr. Graham? Right. Mary, have you any idea?
So it's going to be used to encourage visitors back into central London to take advantage of the opening hospitality and cultural sector as the government's roadmap unfolds.
Okay, so you'll be spending £5 million trying to get people into the central zones while we leave it. That's great. Okay. The related press release indicated that the work would involve London and Partners. How much of this additional £5 million are London and Partners likely to receive?
So I don't believe, as Phil, if he was able to rejoin, would know more. I don't believe there's been a specific allocation decided. London and Partners have, even pre-pandemic, were leading a partnership with Business Improvement District and other organisations to promote domestic tourism to London. And we know from our research that tourism is actually, visitors, not people who are working in central London, but leisure visitors are actually the key factor in the economy and in the central activity zone. And London and Partners will, continue to work with partners, and Mayor will support them to carry out our statutory responsibility to promote domestic tourism in London.
Okay, and I note that the core funding for London and Partners has been trimmed by £2 million. I was just wondering whether they were going to get it through a different venue, i.e. through some of this £5 million. When will you make that decision? So
it's a decision where I think the detailed allocations will follow after the mayoral election. There's a mayoral decision the mayor has taken to approve the overall quantum and give some delegated authority to the executive director to progress matters during the pre-election period, given the importance to London's economy. In terms of the London and Partners budget, now this is funding that is separate to what was their plan, and they've had to deliver savings, including they've come to the end of their office lease tenure, and they've moved in. They're moving into Union Street with the Fire Brigade, which both delivers a saving for them and keeps money within the GLA family.
Right. Well, I'll watch that with interest to see if they do, in actual fact, get any of that. Now, you've dressed it up in a fancy way, but this budget removes £24 million from the dedicated Green New Deal mission. with existing work being artificially repackaged to cover part of the shortfall. Does this demonstrate this actually isn't a priority for the Mayor at all? Mr. Bellamy?
No, no, to the contrary. The situation we face under the Green New Deal, £50 million funding that the Mayor announced in February 2020 was funded from business rate growth that Council told us was going to happen pre-pandemic, and then of course the pandemic happened and it didn't. Despite that, we've managed to maintain £22 million of that expenditure, £10 million in the current year, and £6 million each of the two others, as well as maintaining £14 million a year expenditure on other environmental projects and staffing that to enable them. And so actually, yeah, in the circumstances of the scale of the loss of income that we've had that was to fund these activities, I think we've done a very good job in maintaining that. And yeah, the only area where we've really been able to do more in terms of maintaining the things that we lost from the one-off funding was the Young Londoners Fund, given the absolute priority of that. And so, yeah, it comes across clearly, I think, that those two areas are real priorities for the Mayor.
Okay, well, you're putting a far more positive stance on it than the budget does, I have to say. I've got one more question in this section, and then I've got two colleagues that want to come in. Why have the healthy food, healthy weight and mental health and wellbeing missions received only 3 million between them? How can they be said to have partly of importance, a parity of importance, even with the other missions? And does the Mayor think that this funding is sufficient to deliver real progress in these areas?
I'll allow Halima to comment a little on the detail. The fundamental point here, of course, is that we have to recognise the locus of the GLA, and it is clearly fundamentally these are matters for the NHS and supported by public health functions in local authorities, and they're the organisations who will make the biggest contribution to the delivery of these missions, which as missions are collaborative work amongst partners.
Okay, I shall stop at this point and then I'll pick it up afterwards. I've got Dr. Sahota followed by Tony Devonish. And then Lindsay.
Thank you, Chair. Just following on from the Chairman's question, David, public health programme budget has been reduced by 2/3. In 2021, it was 0.9 million, and in 2021/22, it's becoming 0.3. So why are we with such a reduction of 2/3 of public health spending budget when we've just gone through the biggest public health crisis this country's known?
There have been a lot of changes to the budget and also the structure of the team for next year, and so I think that presentation might be slightly misleading. Halima, would you like to just expand on that, please?
Yes, absolutely. So that's right. So part of what's going on is that we have in the new budget framework, there are 3 blocks now that relate to health. So we have 2 health missions, one on mental health and well-being and one on healthy food, healthy weight. And then we have a foundation block, which is where our public health work and all of our health and care partnership work sits. So in fact, we have been able to protect the funding allocated across those 3 blocks. And so as David said, so it's that needs to be factored in when we look at the overall investment. And then of course we will be working closely with partners as we deliver the mission. So it's really a way of us sort of combining our contribution with the contribution from other partners in the system.
Okay, thank you for the answer. But I mean, it's very important. Perhaps you could highlight. I mean, you say you protected it, right? But there hasn't been any increase in the public health expenditure. Okay, and perhaps would you consider expanding or increasing the amount of money on public health in the coming years, or is this something which you think is not your role but the role of other people?
Assembly Member, I think there has been an increase in the spend on health. So if you look to Appendix B, which provides the mapping against directorates, the health team's budget has increased from £3.3 million in the current year to 4.1 million in each of next year and 4.2 million the year after. So overall, there is an increase in spending on health, and as Helena says, there have been some changes in terms of how it's distributed.
Okay, thank you, David. Thank you.
Okay, now Tony Devonish.
Thank you, Chair. I think Dr. Sahato made my point for me almost, David. You know, if a distinguished doctor like him thinks that the public health budget has been cut, which of course would be frankly a ludicrous thing after a global pandemic, surely your paperwork and what we've been discussing at all these budget meetings, David, simplicity and transparency, I was always taught when I went into local government. You know, you've got holes of money here, there and everywhere, and therefore your officers even have trouble explaining to a distinguished doctor what is the budget situation in public health. It is a bit of a mess, isn't it, David?
No, I don't think it is at all. And the figures I was just able to quote to the doctor came directly from the budget document. And what I would say is that simplicity and transparency, sometimes can be in conflict with each other. And what this budget document is actually by far, I think, the largest and most transparent presentation of the GLA budget there has ever been, and very clearly takes the reader through where the money comes from and how it is allocated, and it's very clear.
Are you seriously saying this is clearer than all the 4 budgets you've done as the Mayor's Chief of Staff, and indeed the 16 before, 15 before your administration? Because I think even officers privately always tell myself and AM Hall that the documents have got less clear, less transparent, particularly this year. And I know COVID's partly the reason, and I'll give you that, but actually the documents aren't clear on the whole, and we've had real issues trying to get clarity. You know, a number of times people have said to me, your documents are like literally, there's just no detail there. It's not even a budget. It's a discussion we've been having for months.
Yeah, that just doesn't tie in at all with what the documents look like. They very clearly take the reader through in a way that, to be honest, has not been managed before. And I remember Assembly Member Duval giving us feedback about this a couple of years ago, and they very clearly take us through the sources of funding, how they're then allocated, and then through in detail. There are very detailed explanations for every mission and every foundation, setting out what has been stopped or reduced, what is continuing, what is new, both tables setting that out and commentary. The documents are very clear. I get a very clear dividing line between where external funding is being used, where internal funding is being used, where discretionary income is being used, and they're very clear as well about the divide between revenue and capital. I think there's a real increase in transparency in this document this year, and yes, the approach to having foundations and missions is a different one to that was there before, but regardless of that, it was inevitable there will be significant change in the budget this year given the pandemic and its impact. And I think this document, which at 101 pages is virtually the same length as the Treasury's budget document for the entire country, set things out very carefully in appropriate detail.
Okay, that's your explanation. The other issue, you mentioned that there'll be more clarity in terms of how the money's going to be actually spent after the mayoral election. Have you got a date when that will become clear? Are you not worried that, as often happens in local government, there will be in 12 months' time a massive underspend in certain categories?
So what we will be doing, of course, is providing monitoring information every quarter in the usual way. What we are going to do, hopefully, during the pre-election period and in the month or so thereafter, is review the format of that information. And I'm really happy to take on board any suggestions that you have, Assembly Member or members of the committee, because we do want to make it as useful as possible, both for Assembly Members and members of the public. So all constructive suggestions about how we can present that information would be very welcome.
And finally, Chair, COP26 is probably the most important conference of the year. You never seem to mention it, although it's in November. And are your various green budgets aligned to make sure that the GLA supports what we're trying to achieve at COP26?
Yeah, I think they are. There's Phil Graham, if he's on the meeting now, may want to comment more on the detail of them, but we absolutely have resource in there for all the various areas of environment, and that includes the capacity for us to engage, and we'll have for instance, National Climate Week this summer, which absolutely we intend to be part of, and absolutely it's going to be at the forefront of the work of the GLA this year and on an ongoing basis, given the climate emergency we face.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Duval.
Okay, I think we're going to come back onto the issues of transparency, and I think we have made some steps, but there are some still outstanding problems. And one of the outstanding problems is about the time information is presented, and I'm just saying we would have had a different set of questions, I think, to the executive if we had this information at the time we were making the budget. And I just want, now the questions that I want to get behind is, I get it, there's a mixture of cuts here and there's a mixture of reprioritising, and what I think is lost in some of the detail that you're presenting is about how you've prioritised that. Can you just explain to us about what's, in terms of a political priority, David, and the emphasis you've made? Then I've got a set of questions to elucidate a little bit more behind some of the decision making on individual programmes. So could you just outline to us what the process was inside the GLA, officers presenting information to you, I presume, and then you making some choices? Can you just give us a bit more detail about that, of how you decided to the extent, because that might go to the art of members questioning around why you're doing X and not doing Y.
Yeah, happy to do so, Assembly Member. So the process really began back in about August time, after, because the first business we had to obviously was repurpose this year's budget, given the huge impact of the pandemic on plans for the year. And after that, we then started work on the budget for 21-22. The initial focus was on our core and statutory activities, because as you will appreciate, they're the things that we have no choice but to do, and we needed to go through them in detail and look at what efficiencies we could hope to drive. And as that process started reaching conclusions in maybe September into October, that was aligning with the timeline on the Recovery Board, determining the missions that it wished to pursue, which, if I remember correctly, I don't have the date in front of me, but I think they formally approved them in November, but clearly through the Recovery Task Force, our officers were leading that work, and so we had some visibility and involvement in shaping that. And through those discussions, that really gave us a view of where the areas where the GLA could really make most difference would be, both in terms of the missions, but also in terms of reminding us of the value of the work that the GLA undertakes itself. And so it was really that stuff, as in October and going into November, that led us to propose, and based on those discussions and obviously our knowledge of what the work the GLA was doing to date, to propose the draft mission and foundation total budgets that were set out in the draft budget that we discussed back in November. And then from there, obviously through the process, there was a great deal of uncertainty about how much income the GLA would actually have to spend in the end. But what we were, what we then were able to do was in December and January, working on the assumption that those budgets would be overall affordable in the context of the money the GLA would receive. Detailed discussions with officers and deputy mayors over a number of rounds to go through each individual project, all the ideas for new projects, and try and build those into proposals. That then led to a series of meetings in the middle of January, at which we went through the output of those discussions and discussed the remaining areas that were outstanding, and those points then obviously where decisions were required were run past the mayor, and that's then what we kind of had in the books. And then it was a case, obviously, of updating the budget in response to the group final draft budget, and that's what leads us into the position we have here. I hope that's a helpful summary.
That's a good starter. Okay, so I just want to go on the surface of some of these issues. So we've done some fantastic work in the GLA in the last 5 years around homelessness. It's been a combination of GLA working with partners and London boroughs and government. I see a reduction on paper of 1.15 million reductions. Is that the additional work done, emergency work in COVID, and the core homelessness programme isn't really going to be affected? Because I see a combination of things from some of that prevention work. And what I really need to understand, and I think I do from reading the paperwork, that for people seeing that would say, actually, why are you cutting that level? Because in one of your mission statements of economic recovery is to making sure we're looking out for those people that may well be affected by economic downturns, from mental health to addiction to whatever, because the circumstances they're into. So can we just, is it about, because those funding streams have come to a head, but the core money, you have protected that core budget and it is the same, or is it a lesser service we're providing?
Yeah, I think, Assembly Member, the first thing I should say is take this opportunity to publicly congratulate and thank those officers who've worked on this stuff in the last year. You may know that they won a Health Services Journal Award on Wednesday evening for their work, and it has been literally been, compared to other world cities, it's literally been life-saving, and I think we should all be very proud of them. In terms of the budget, absolutely we maintain the Mayor's core spending on rough sleeping. The areas of change, and Ricardo may want to add more on this if you wish, is firstly previous one-off allocations the Mayor's been able to make from additional income. Obviously the additional income isn't there, so he's not able to do that. And secondly is the ebb and flow of government funding, which is often very received on a relatively short-term basis, and then spends out into the months ahead, and that it creates a challenging environment for the team to plan their services, and but then a challenging environment for colleagues to follow through in terms of the budget documents. But the Mayor's commitment absolutely remains firm in this area.
Well, thank you for that, and I share your gratitude to the staff and our partners who've delivered really great outcomes. And I think that even though we're with the core programme, I suspect there's still going to be pressures, but I hope there's opportunities when you come to look at this area that you can put some more money into it to achieve what I think we did during COVID, which is fantastic work, but ongoing work for all the partners concerned. Whilst Ricardo is present, there's another question for E's area. I don't, look, it may well be because some of the budget. So we have a view, and there was a conversation in the Assembly at the very beginning of the administration about the levels that you put into opportunity areas, and Old Oak Park comes to mind, whether we put too much money in, do we need it, don't we need it? I see from the paperwork that we're taking a 4.4 million reduction into the work on the Royal Docks, which is an opportunity area. Now, is this because it's over-programming and not required, and therefore it's gone back to the centre, or has it gone into the cuts processes, or is it been reprioritised to the economic recovery? I'm not clear. What does that mean for the work of the Royal Docks area, considering we're about to relocate to the area? So I just need to understand that a little bit more. If you're able to do it, if not, I'll take it from Ricardo.
I'll try, and then Ricardo may want to add more detail, which is, so our work in the Royal Docks is funded through the enterprise zone there, and so it's not a case about the mayor saying how much should I spend on the Royal Docks this year. The Royal Docks is funded by borrowing that is done against future business rate income that's ring fenced prudently to repay that borrowing, and so then the question, what is presented in the GLA budget is the anticipated forecast spend, and that obviously will ebb and flow based on individual activities and projects. I don't know, Ricardo, if you want to say more about the work of the team in the Royal Docks and what's coming up there.
Thank you, David. So, yeah, you're absolutely right in your summary there, David. What the intended expenditure for 21-22 reflects is a planned programme of work, including a combination of cultural placemaking, improvements of the public realm, and also looking at access routes, in and around the docks and to the Crystal and the new City Hall when it arrives. So it's purely a reflection of programmed work and a realistic profile of expenditure rather than a reduction in spending.
So we're not delaying any work on it. It's not actual specific programs, and if it's required, then you've got the flexibility to bring that money back into that particular project.
Absolutely, but I should flag that we need to, in terms of sort of the cultural placemaking and public events and so on, that will clearly be dictated by the virus, by COVID-19. So, we don't want to over-program or over-plan, but we do think that what we've set out, subject to reopening beyond COVID-19, that we've got a programme of works from the summer onwards through to the end of the financial year, which currently reflects the spending that has been set out. But yes, there is flexibility if there's more we can do within the year.
Okay. And now, Chair, can I just go back onto an earlier issue you raised about cultural activities and the culture programme and London and Partners? Given that the economic recovery programme, and given where London's economy is, and the second largest element of our economy is cultural activities and tourism. So in terms of the reductions that have gone in, I see that one of your increases is the 5 million initiatives to the Central London's activity zone, which I think is needed, I'd say that. But equally, what I don't understand in this economic recovery programme for all, I represent an area which is the second largest visitor destination outside Zone 1. So, in terms of your cultural programming and what you're trying to achieve, and in terms of tourism, how much of the 2 million reduction in London Partners is opportunity cost? I didn't quite understand some of your answers. Or is that money that's been repriority as it gone into other areas? And I presume the 278k reductions in the cultural programme overall is being either put into other programmes. And really it's about the politics of it, but also about the issues of it. Now, there's a lot of issues with the London and Partners as a model of delivery, set that aside, but that 2 million is pretty significant in an area where hospitality, inward investment in terms of economic recovery, tourism, because it's the old London Tourism Board mission issues come out of there. Where has that gone, and are we going to see it in a new way, or has that disappeared because they've been opportunity costs and they've been taken in? It's more about this is more efficient and the rest of it because of the moves going into whatever we call it, the new building they're moving into?
So, thank you, Senator Amber. I think a few issues in there. Firstly, in terms of the culture budget, it's worth noting that that will just ebb and flow through the nature of one-off projects that have variable spend patterns. So, for instance, the Fourth Plinth project, the net cost varies based on whether it's a year in which there's a new artwork to commission, or potentially there's income from the sale of a previous artwork and so forth. Similarly, in terms of London Borough of Culture, that has varying profiles associated with it, and so that kind of complicates the overall picture. But I think one of the things that you articulated very well there, and I think actually one of the things that has we've really succeeded in getting a greater understanding of in the last few years is the value of culture. Yes, to us as humans, but it's not just some sort of soft thing. Like the hard economic value is absolutely critical, and the research for the Central Activity Zone does demonstrate that. You are absolutely right to highlight the importance of tourism in certain other areas around London. Greenwich clearly, absolutely is one of those, and I know you and the Mayor had a visit down there a few months ago, which I know the Mayor found very, very useful to meet some of those people in the sector there in Greenwich. I guess what I would say is that firstly, yes, there is a look at Central Activity Zone, but absolutely London and Partners and the GLA will work with colleagues from Greenwich, both the council and local businesses. And it's also really important to remember, I think, that with tourism, the centre of London is often the attraction that gets people to decide to visit, particularly when you're looking at international tourists. But then, the trick in what we do is encouraging them to go further afield, and that's true within London in terms of Greenwich. It's also, of course, true on a national level, and the fundamental point of the tourism approach that Visit Britain would take is that London's the attraction, and we say, well, now you're in the country, well, go and look at this great place in Yorkshire, or wherever it may be. And so that's very much the principle. In terms of L&P, the savings there are regrettable. They will have an impact. Phil Graham may want to say more about that. The really, L&P are having to change its focus in the year ahead. And yes, there's a significant saving from their office move, which, as outlined earlier, is a good and beneficial thing, but also from some of the inward investment in London work that they were previously doing, and sadly that will have to stop because there isn't the funding there to do it.
Okay, so if the funding's going to stop, there must be another way that we're going to deal with that, because there may well be, if there's any opportunities that arrive in the future, we still need to have a landing deck for some of that investment terms. And I believe some of that money was funded by central government, and there lies another problem with, I think, in the budget about, and it does go to transparency, which, but again, it wasn't a feature in the past. We're doing more and more work with other partners, and we need to track. So I've been following some of the Mayor's press releases, which will feature in this budget, but it's not quite clear of some of the issues. So back in the 12th of March, the Mayor issued and provided 250,000, I think, of paired 50 freelancers with cultural organisations to develop proposals to improve work conditions for freelancers hit by COVID-19. Now, I know it's a one-off payment around those issues, but, we do need to think, going back to an earlier contribution from a colleague, how do we track these issues? I can equally look at some other issues in job creation about some of the money that was put into that, which will obviously be rolled forward. I'm very committed to the work the Mayor has done around anchor institutions with businesses signing up for opportunities for young people during these difficult times. there are some things, so I do think on the transparency issue, I think we have to have another discussion. I welcome your earlier commitment about how do we move forward in different times around some of these programmes. On the cultural one, all I say is I think we need to understand the ins and outs of the money and where it's going and what does it mean for your cultural plan and what does it mean for in and outer. I get the principle that you said that you're still committed to doing that, but I think there is a danger in economic recovery that that might not be, given the paperwork you've submitted or the increases of where things go. I'm now moving on to my final points, and I just want to go into the... Also, there's one last cultural question, which is more about eventing, and it's a bit difficult to talk about when we face these restrictions. So setting aside the one-off spends on the U8 events in 21, 22, 23, what will be the impact of the 1/3 reduction in event spend from the level of 5.5 million to 3.7 million? And I do say this, and I've got to say this in terms of, you know, I do think I'm not one of those who've got an air shirt for these events and they cost money. But I do think when we come to making cuts, I just wonder whether we over-program or whether there is, I don't know, you could say that across all issues, but I think it's in eventing or in big, like the Olympics, you know, in terms of spend, I just wonder about our forecasting and what we're trying to spend on. So could someone just tell me what that impact actually is in reality and what won't we be doing or choosing to do around that event? And of course, events like that are part of our economic activity of attracting spend into the area and being a premier capital city for people to visit, but also that we're making a statement to the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll say a little, and then Nira might be able to come in on the specifics of the budget. But I actually should just respond on your previous point, Assembly Member, about funding and transparency. I do genuinely, I think we have made real progress in setting out much more clearly money from external sources that comes into the GLA. I think we've made real progress on that. What we haven't made progress on yet, and is the next step, and in one sense it's slightly out with the budget because it's never our money, but where and London Borough Culture actually is an example where the Mayor setting the scheme and providing some funding, other partners come in and provide funding, but it doesn't come through the GLA books, so we don't see that the value that we've leveraged from the funding that the Mayor provides. Now, I think what you said really actually indicated how challenging it can be to accurately represent some of that. But it's something I'm very interested in because I think it's it really is a way of demonstrating the power of the mayoralty and what actually is being achieved by Londoners through both that convening power, but also the ability to say, well, I'm putting it, I will put in some money, and if you will, external funder, and that really creates something. And clearly, in a world in which we all expect funding to be constrained in the years ahead, it's going to become more important, not less. And so difficult because it never flows through our books. But I am very interested in how we can better articulate that and show the contributions that the Mayor's getting wider partners to make. In terms,
Sorry, go. Sorry,
I was going to go to major events, but do you want to come back to what I just said?
No.
Okay. In terms of major events, you're absolutely right about their importance to London and their, both direct economic benefit and also indirect benefit as it puts London potentially on television screens around the world. And Niran will say more. We have to, in terms of those events, think a little and be a bit tougher about some of the community benefits from those events that we would like to obtain. And we have to really ensure that they are driving the benefits, because of course the problem we face is that the economic benefit from these events overwhelmingly flows to the Treasury, and that's unlike other cities around the world who might be bidding for these events where because they have so many more taxes devolved to them, the economic benefit that flows, and I think, for instance, you remember the MLB in summer 2019, you could just see the economic benefit, couldn't you, around the city? There's just so many people there, and clearly had come into town for the event and lots of additional expenditure. But that overwhelmingly flows to the government, and for other cities who receive sales taxes, income taxes, property taxes, etc., it flows directly to them, and that's one of the challenges with the arrangements we have in this country, that means that we get looked at to make the expenditure, but we don't really see the benefit. Niran, do you add a little more on that?
No, can I intervene? We are running really over time now. Assembly Member Deval, are you missing any financial information?
The information, I'm quite happy to have that written and shared with the committee back off then. There is one more crucial bit, Chair, to ask, is about the transparency around the Green New Deal and following up on the questions that you asked. There's a significant reduction in the number of environmental programmes, including the 9 million reduction in commercial boiler replacement. There may be good reasons for that, because we need to be a cost. But one of the issues in the economic recovery programme that needs to is that we've got to have that change that we keep talking about in terms of tackling climate change, and a pretty significant step change in the way we do our programme. I see the 9 million reduction in the commercial boiler, is that a replacement for a grant? And then we only see a 4.2 million new Green Deal increase in retrofitting to expand programmes and leverages. Can we do better about explaining those issues? Where is that money, and where will there be if there are new opportunities to expand that programme? Because that's one area where we need to make a difference in this economic recovery programme, changing behaviours, getting investment into Green New Deal, and to make sure it's better for the environment. I wonder if Mr. Bellamy could comment on that.
Can you be quite concise on this? I've got another Assembly member waiting to ask questions.
Okay, I can say very little on the commercial boiler point, which is it was LEAP funding, and we found that the uptake for that scheme wasn't there as expected, and I think what became apparent was that people in commercial premises who are eligible for the scheme so often rent these premises on a relatively short-term basis, and therefore weren't confident enough about their long-term prospects and their long-term use of the building to want to take up that scheme. And so to the extent that there weren't bids, the LEAP decided to take that money back and spend it on other things, environmental related things, I should add.
I'm happy to take a rip on that next question, on the answer from the officer, and if it's shared with the committee as well.
Yes, please. We'd appreciate that. Please, if you can arrange that, Mr. Bellamy. Assembly Member Berry.
Thanks very much, Chair. Really interesting point about the boiler scrappage scheme. I think I was involved in the government's boiler scrappage scheme of 2010, and getting the design of that right so that it's landlords and the people owning the buildings who are applying is really important. That one was oversubscribed, and so maybe I can help with the next one. I do want to ask though about the Young Londoners Fund. It was quite hard to get from the original budget documents the sort of details of what's going on here, but I think the combination of what's in the Merrill decision in relation to the reserves and the information that's in there in the the revenue programme budgets that's a bit more detailed about what's going on, shone some light on this. And obviously I was worried, and I quoted it to Sophie in the Police and Crime Committee yesterday. Obviously she referred me to this meeting because this is where it's part of the GLA's budget rather than MOPAC's budget. And there what we've got is the Young Londoners Fund spending for the current year that's just finishing or finished. We have got 14.4 million going out, which is really good. Next year, there's only 7.6 million going out, and then the following year, 3.375 million going out through that fund. Now, within the mayoral decision, you can see that £20.4 million is being drawn down from the Young Londoners Fund reserve. So we've been looking to see where the other money is going from, if only 7,683 is going out in this year. And it seems like in the core missions document, the document here about the programme spending, there's something called Core Mission Fund. And if you look at the New Deal for Young People table, that's basically the only money that's in there apart from the adult education budget is this drawdown from the Young Londoners Fund reserve. About half of it's going to the Young Londoners Fund, about half of it's going to Core Mission Fund. So I want to hear more about what that is, but also to ask about the comments made in section 8.25 of the mayoral decision, which basically says it is not envisaged the GLA will continue to fund services for young people at the scale that's been made possible by previous one-off allocations. So, yeah, you're winding down the Young Londoners Fund slightly faster than I would have thought. This core mission fund is being created. It's not envisaged that further council tax or business rate surpluses are going to go and top up the Young Londoners Fund reserve. What's the plan? It seems to be a winding down of support for youth services.
So, yeah, happy to talk through that. A few different things there. Firstly, so Young Londoners funding was originally, there was a £45 million allocation, and that was made from one-off sources of income growth, business rates and council tax. And what we said at the time, and have said consistently ever since, is that there is no way that the GLA can, out of the core tax it receives, fund these services. We are, in many senses, stepping in to areas where local authorities would be funding if they had the ability to do so. And core GLA funding and baseline is never designed to do that. But the Mayor absolutely sees it as a priority, and that's why whenever we have the one-off income available, we've used it. So we have that 45 million, and that's why also he made a further 25 million allocation in the 2021 group budget. And despite the income that's coming from not actually ultimately being realised, we've managed to maintain that by taking tough decisions elsewhere. What you see in the budget then is two things. You see a drawdown on reserves, which is the remaining committed spend from the 45 million, which has all been allocated to projects, and they're necessarily, of course, multi-year projects, as you would expect. And so you'll see that funding going out and going into projects. Yeah. Then we are left with the 25 million. Now, a small amount of that, $1 million or so, was spent this summer into autumn on activities, and then the balance of that, is shown.
Sorry, I'm asking about the drawdown and reserve plan for 21-22, not what you've done this year.
Yes, and so I said there's drawdown in reserves, which there are two reasons why you'll see a drawdown from reserve. One is the spend of the remaining of the 45 million, which is all committed to projects, which are multi-year projects, and they will come out. The other is the 25 million pound allocation, which, as I was just saying, just over $1 million of which was spent this year, but the balance was put into reserves and will be drawn down next year and in the two subsequent years. And that drawdown there you can see that you've highlighted in the core mission fund, the just under £8 million. And as the budget document says, as we look to allocate that, we are looking at the idea of a contribution to a new collaborative young people's fund, which was something we were starting to look at actually pre-pandemic, and that thinking has gone into London Community Response Fund, which is really sought to pool donors, so money from the mayor and money from many other donors and sources, to ensure that we don't duplicate and we get the best possible value. And so really, yeah, the work ahead of us is to try and establish such a fund that basically funders are able to contribute and we get the best consistent source of funding for activities to support young people. The mayor is still absolutely committed to this, but his ability to fund this, is dependent on one-off income, i.e., business rates growth or council tax collection fund surpluses. We have to be honest and realistic to say that we don't expect those to happen in the next few years, and that's why we need to look at this initiative, because we need to find other sources of money and other ways of funding these really much needed schemes.
I'm still not clear about what's happened to the original money for the Young Londoners Fund, because the reserve that's been reduced this year by £20 million is called the Young Londoners Fund Reserve. And you've just said that this is basically split in half to fund all of the activities that are not funded by the adult education budget under the New Deal for Young People mission. And it's gone into things that are not the Young Londoners Fund. So that's what I mean, you have cut back on what was originally planned for the...
Let's remember, so the Young Londoners Fund, if you look at the original £45 million, £15 million of that was allocated to mayoral projects in this space. So the Stepping Stones project is one example that comes to mind. The other £30 million was then allocated in two tranches to bids from external groups. Yeah, and so what you see here in this document is exactly the same thing. Some allocations made to GLA group specific initiatives to support young people. So the VRU's My Ends Community Connectors programme being an example, which is...
VRU's under MOPAC, that's a separate budget.
VRU is, yes, the VRU is under MOPAC, but the GLA mayor budget is, as it sets out, spending £1.5 million contributing to a VRU project, which is My Ends Community Connectors, which is something which local areas have bid for, and the quality of bids that the VRU received was brilliant and really high demand, and so it made sense to provide more funding so that the VRU could achieve more in that space. So what you see in terms of the allocation of the Young Londoners Fund money is some of it going into GLA group schemes which benefit young people, and others then are, yes, allocated for groups. So that's true. So there's £1 million contribution to Wave 5 of the London Community Response, which is money that all goes out to groups supporting young people who bid for that funding. And it's done on a collective basis rather than being a distinct bid into GLA, that individual GLA officers are the sole ones going through those bids. We're working on a pooled basis with other funders to maximise the benefit of funding.
Okay, no, I mean, fair enough. That does account for the money, so that's useful. We've had this conversation for a number of years, me and the mayor, about the importance of youth services. The sort of things that help young people to thrive, and that, I think we have lost that emphasis, I think, from some of the ways in which you said the Young Londoners Fund original money has been allocated there. I'm very supportive of the VRU, and I asked the mayor at the MPT budget meeting about the split of money, the £38 million being 30 million to enforcement and 8 to prevention. But that's another 8 that's gone into, for example, violence reduction, victim support services, some of which went into the My Ends type projects as well. But also a lot of it went into things that I think are not so much the youth services that we all thought of at the beginning. They are things like, tracking young offenders, getting involved with young people at a much sort of later stage of intervention than the general youth services that are really being cut back on. So yeah, like I said to Sophie, I don't think this breaks the bank committing to keep putting 10 to 15 million pounds into this fund so that it's got some resilience, some security, some ability to fund longer term projects. But we can keep doing that, and we can also keep redoubling our efforts to the government, because I think ultimately, like you say, we were never filling the entire gap in youth services that councils have to create, and so we need to keep up that pressure on the government, but keeping the focus on the need for youth services, I think, is something that us, the mayor, you, David, Mary, everybody can keep acknowledging. I'm just slightly worried that we're diverting away from this original idea, and young people need this more than ever.
Yeah, I don't think we are diverting away from it at all. We're doing exactly Young Londoners Fund stuff, and yes, some things directly through GLA group schemes, and some things as available pots for people to bid for. And we're, as I say, we're going for an approach where we work collaboratively with other funders to maximise the value and effectiveness of the money that's collectively available. And I think you're absolutely right when you say that, look, there are need for kind of general youth services, and equally some of the other things you talked about that we're funding, there's absolutely a need for them. The problem is, isn't it, there's not enough money to do all the things that need to be done, and so it's a difficult balancing act to try and break down that funding. And we're all familiar with the needs and challenges around youth violence at the moment, and we've got to absolutely we've got to make an investment there, as we have in more general positive services.
Yeah, no worries. And that's great. It is a question of priorities, and we can all keep arguing about that for the future as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Colleagues, I'm going to steam through the very short part that's left of this, and then we'll get on to the next section. So, David Bellamy, if you could just answer really a yes or no. Do you think it would have been more transparent for the options this final version of the budget sets out to have been subjected to scrutiny in public before the point at which they were finalised? You presented this committee with something you're going to do rather than something you're proposing to do. And I'd say that was an important difference, wouldn't you?
Now, I think what I would say is that, as I said earlier, there are very little differences in the allocations to each foundation and mission compared to the draft budget in November. And we were fortunate in November to be able to discuss plans in those areas, and that's something we had to do. It is the scale of the effort in repurposing the budget to meet the challenge of COVID-19 at a time when we are all also so focused on the response operation has been incredibly difficult. And it's a fundamental fact of the statutory budget process that we can't finalise the GLA Mayor budget until we have a final group budget. We only had that after the Assembly plenary on the 25th of February. So the timetable is inevitable given the uncertainties that we had.
But the draft had no programme budgets. It's basically, like you may as well have said, we're going to spend £10 million on puppies and apple pie. Just not helpful, quite frankly. Very briefly, please, how can GLA staff and stakeholders plan ahead for the new financial year with just 3 weeks' notice following the publication of the GLA Mayor budget on the 10th of March?
Well, one of the things that's different, Chair, to when I got here was I found that when I got here, the GLA Mayor budget actually was getting finalised and published in April. And I always believe that's wrong, and we've tried to pull it forward and get it done in March. But it is a basic reality that, as with all the functional bodies, as with the Assembly's budget, you can't finalise and publish your budget until the group budget completes, and the timetable for that is driven, as was just said, by very significant statutory limitations.
Okay, I don't think we're going to agree on that. So I think I'll go on to the next section. And I'm going to put these questions to David Galley, if I may, please. David, why was the 92.5% included as the business rate safety net in the December 2020 consultation budget when the 27th of November 2020 letter from the Secretary of State of Housing, Communities and Local Government to English councils stated that the GLA would continue with a 97% level from the previous year?
Good morning, Chairman, committee members. Thank you for that question. The reason why we kept to the same assumptions at that particular time was due to the continuing uncertainties about the business rates pooling at that point. Now, the Secretary of State's letter assumed that business rates pooling would continue, but as we know, the London councils and the mayor have agreed that that would be abandoned, and that then created a material change in circumstances, in my view, which then is absolutely vital in understanding the decisions I subsequently made on the level of safety net I assumed in the budgets going forward.
The draft local government settlement announced on the 17th of December as well, it also confirmed that 97% safety net would be in place, didn't it?
That's correct, but the issue remains that because of the uncertainty created by the abandonment of the London-wide pooling arrangements, in my view, meant there was a greater risk of that safety net actually being at a lower level than was announced in the provisional local government settlement on the 17th of December.
But you had two sizable indications within a month from the government that the safety net level would not change from 97%, but you kept it at 92% or 92.5% anyway.
But that's because the government were not aware, and indeed it wasn't until the 12th of January that the Chair of London Councils and the Mayor wrote to the Secretary of State formally asking that the London business rates pooling arrangements be abandoned. And I think it's important to recognise that if you're looking at the equivalent regime for the situation we have now in 21-22, which is where we have at London two pilots, one the TfL devolution of grants and the second being the London-wide pooling arrangements. If you go back to when we had for the first time just the TfL arrangements being devolved, the safety net that was then in place was 92.5%. So I had the knowledge that we were going to abandon the London-wide pooling arrangements, which then created a risk in my mind of a significant change to our safety net threshold in the final local government settlement.
Can you confirm what evidence did you have that the pooling arrangement would end?
Well, I've been in negotiations with all the borough treasurers over a long period of time. We are obviously central to those arrangements, and given the losses on business rates that were becoming apparent, and apparent obviously at a very early stage, hence the Mayor's budget guidance back in June, there was quite clearly an issue about what London would collectively decide on the pooling arrangements. And so that was, clearly to my mind, an evident risk that was arising from the loss of business rates that has now occurred.
So on what basis was 92.5% chosen for the consultation budget? Being, if you think about it, the GLA had not been at that level for quite some time.
Well, it goes back to the Mayor's budget guidance issued in June, where we set out a series of scenarios, one of which we ultimately chose scenario 3, which assumed that degree of business rate losses that then led to the savings rounds that were then launched across the GLA group.
But what basis did you go down that far? I mean, what calculation did you use? What support for calculations did you use to get down to that low? I mean, it's unduly pessimistic, don't you think?
No, as I explained earlier, and let me repeat, because the equivalent regime where we only had the TfL pilot business rate arrangements had a safety net of 92.5%. That was the basis upon which we then set out 92.5% being the assumption that I used in the draft consultation budget and the Mayor's first draft budget in January.
Okay, so despite two sizable indications within a month, it's 97, you're still at this pessimistic stage. David Bellamy, the Mayor told the 5th of January 2021 meeting of this committee that business rates are a big concern. Why would he say that, given reassuring content of the 27th of November 2020 letter from the Secretary of State?
So there'll be a number of issues there. Firstly, that the letter, as the Executive Director has set out, was received before MHCLG were advised that the pool was not going to be in operation. And as the Executive Director said, the last time we had equivalent arrangements for business rates, which I think from memory was 2017-18, the government implemented a safety net of 92.5%. So it therefore seemed very reasonable to assume, and we certainly should on a prudent basis, that with the safety net, with the abandonment of the pool, hopefully only for a year, but nevertheless, taking us back to the circumstances of 2017-18, the safety net would be at the same level. So that's the first issue. The second issue is the huge uncertainty about business rates, and that manifests itself in a number of ways. There's obviously the economic uncertainty about organisations' ability to pay business rates, given the huge economic pressures they're facing, and obviously that is dependent to some extent on the extent and nature of government support for them, which of course has changed, and there have been additional and welcome announcements from the Chancellor since the 5th of January. There is also the issue around business rate rules and material change of circumstances. And what it is clear, we all have lived it, organisations have not been able to make full use of their business premises over the last year, and therefore under the terms of the business rate system they can argue for a reduction in the value of the rateable values, and therefore the amounts they have to pay, and that this can be backdated. And so this means significant uncertainties, because we don't know whether it will be a 15% reduction, 20% reduction. Some rating agents say that offices should be reduced by 65% rateable values. So there is huge uncertainty. And the final thing that then is uncertain, here we are, I believe, 8 working days from the end of the financial year, and the government still hasn't confirmed the arrangements for the compensation scheme for business rate losses this year. And so we have huge uncertainty. We don't know how much money we will receive for this year, never mind last year, and that's why the Mayor made the comment he did.
Okay, but just before I go back to David Galley, by your answers, you clearly knew that if it was 97%, there would be an extra £100 million there for you to use, which miraculously was used in February. You knew about that from the beginning then?
So,
yes or no?
It's not a yes or no question.
When did you know that 100 million would be there?
So we knew clearly that if you have a higher safety net and the situation around what business rates is actually paid and the material change of circumstances risk means that without a safety net your income would be lower, you knew the safety net would come into play.
Okay.
What we didn't know, given the variables, was what quantum that would be, given the range of uncertainties. Okay,
so you clearly understood that from the beginning. So going back to David Galley, why did you just not then present the 97% figure with caveats and cautionary statements in the draft budget, which is an approach you took with other elements of the draft local government settlement? Why didn't you do that?
Chairman, if that's, if I can just come back to amplify Chief of Staff's answer. think one of the things that's important to understand about the safety net is that the actual sum of money that we would receive, be protected from in the safety net, is fundamentally dependent on the pooling arrangements. So, for instance, if the London-wide pooling arrangements had continued, then GLA, given that the pooling arrangements across London would look at the aggregate position across London, GLA would actually ended up paying for some of the business rates losses in Westminster, for instance, and the city. So the actual sum, 106 million, that was ultimately the figure in safety net, was not known at the point earlier in the conversations. To turn to your question about why did I not put in caveats around, say, the 97%, was that my duty is to set out what I think is the likely level of resources that the Mayor has available at his disposal. And as we said earlier, the key consideration there was the uncertainty around the safety net, despite the government announcing 97% in provisional settlement. And so my obligation was to set out what I feel was the likely level of resources, mindful, as you will well know, that it would not be until the Borough Building Authority returns in early February and the final local government settlement, which was not agreed until the 10th of February, that we could ultimately know the absolute overall level of resources that the Mayor had at his disposal. And in particular, as David has emphasised earlier on, it's important to look at the overall position of business rates. It's not just a case of looking at the 21-22 safety net. We need to look at the overall position of business rates in this financial year, 2021 and 21-22. And the present state, as Chief of Staff has mentioned, is that we still have an unbelievably high level of uncertainty about what our business rates income will be.
Yeah,
so the total level of business rates, if I can finish, the total level of business rates that we'd have available would be dependent also on the position in 2021 as well as 21-22. So in terms of the level of uncertainty we were facing in the time we had to produce the draft budget was absolutely fundamental and endemic. And so my view, my professional view, was that we had a material risk of a lower level of safety net that would mean that at that particular point, I could not advise the Mayor that that was the level of resources he had available to allocate.
The point I'm making, and I think my colleagues will understand, that we have got to look at everything around a budget, take views, see what's a possibility. The government had said twice that it was safe at a 97%, but it didn't even enter the draft budget. My point being, why on earth didn't it enter the draft budget, even if it was put there with caveats? Earlier, David Bellamy was talking about, I think he was talking about missions. He's saying there's detailed explanations, there's commentary, everything's very clear. Well, actually, David Galley, this is not clear because none of us knew that this would be a possibility, that we could get the 97%. You clearly must have known that it was a possibility, and yet it didn't feature at all in the draft January budget.
Yes, but I'm obliged to set out what I think is the best estimate of the overall level of resources, both business rates and council tax, the Mayor would have available to him. And my position was, and I think is been justified by the detail we've supplied to you, that was my best professional view at the time, and that was reflected in the prudent advice that I gave.
Well, I think it was pessimistic advice, but it would have been nice for us to have seen what could have been available, which was an extra £100 million. Now, yesterday, the Mayor was very unclear about the detail around the safety net, specifically that the local government settlement indicated it was that you were going to get 97%. He said, no, I don't think I knew. I don't think I did. When I asked him if he knew at this committee's meeting on the 5th of January, can you confirm if and when you told the Mayor and David Bellamy, although I think we've established David Bellamy obviously knew before then, and what about the senior officers? Were your senior officers aware that the government had said twice that you'll get this 97%, etc.
Say
Who
that.
knew what when? Because no, I'm asking David Galley.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Thank you, Chairman. So as I set out in the detailed correspondence with you, the first time that I discussed the safety net issue of 97% in a level of detail was with the Chief of Staff following your Budget Performance Committee meeting on the 5th of January with the Mayor. And that was in the build-up to the preparation of the first Mayor's draft budget published for the meeting on the 27th of January. The preparation for that discussion was then that I discussed directly with the Mayor the issues of safety net prior to that first Assembly budget plenary. The Chief of Staff, I'm sure, can add more details as to when he may have been able to discuss the issues directly with the Mayor. I understand there was some discussions that may have taken place after I briefed the Chief of Staff. As to my other colleagues, Chief Officer and CMT colleagues, because these are principally an issue to do with the group overall allocation of budget, and recall, most of the business rates, 85% goes to TfL. I didn't think it was necessary or appropriate to discuss these issues in detail with the Chief Officer and CMT prior to the finalisation of the draft budget.
Despite the fact that it could make such a difference to various budgets, you thought you'd keep it to yourself?
No, it's not a question of keeping it to myself, Chairman. The issue was that the allocation of business rates, which is the subject under debate here, 85% of that goes to TfL, and we have set out throughout the negotiations with the government that we would play an absolutely straight bat with them around the proportion of business rates that should be allocated to them. Now, the balance of the business rates that would have been available at that point, as the Mayor has indicated earlier, would have gone to his priorities on policing and fire. So obviously we're into counterfactuals. What would the Mayor have done? Which again, perhaps the Chief of Staff is better placed to answer than myself. But there would have been no presumption in my mind that the additional money from the safety net would have gone to the GLA Mayor or the GLA Assembly budgets.
Well, I'm sorry, I have to tell you, we are very disappointed that suddenly this change happened in February when you clearly knew about it in December, you clearly knew about it in January. It could have gone into the, certainly into the draft budget with caveats all around it, like accountants always do to cover themselves, which I absolutely understand. But the fact that it wasn't in there at all, the fact that you wanted to go to scenario 3, which was the most pessimistic, when there had been 2 assurances from government, I find astonishing. Now I've got lots more questions on this. No, hang on, no, just a minute. I've got 2 assembly members indicating. Assembly member Russ Pigeon wants first, and then I'll bring you in, Assembly member Devonish.
Thank you very much, Chair. I've just been listening very carefully to what you've said, Professor David Galley. What I don't understand is, given this information was provided on the 27th of November and then again on the 17th of December, why you didn't speak to officials at the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government to seek clarification, so then you could be more accurate in your draft budget going forward and in your advice that you're able to provide both to the Mayor but also to the London Assembly, because you are the Finance Director for the GLA, not just the Executive.
I'll just clarify, Caroline, one point. So the 27th of November statement by the Secretary of State, as I think indicated earlier, was obviously without the benefit of the knowledge of the London pooling arrangements being actively discussed between all London around the abandonment of the pool, as was also then the provisional settlement on the 17th of December. It similarly assumed that that pool would continue. And obviously we're in active dialogue with MHCLG civil servants around these issues throughout this process. but it's clearly for them to determine, it's their regime, the regime of safety nets provision for the GLA and for local government nationally.
And to expand on that clarity, it was only on the 12th of January that government were told that the pool was being abandoned, and therefore it was going to be a matter in the final settlement for what the Secretary of State's decision was going to be. And in my experience and working closely with David Galley on this, until there is a ultimately political level decision taken within government, officials can't issue guidance on what's going to happen because they don't know. We had to wait for the settlement to be laid in before Parliament on the 4th of February to know what the position was going to be.
But regardless of the pooling arrangement, because you were clearly having discussions about that and would have known that it might well be that you would put forward dropping this as a way forward, did you, David Galley, have any discussions with officials to try to understand this? Because I would have thought if I was a senior officer, that's exactly what you would try to do, seek some clarification, because you're going to get asked questions by members. Therefore, you would want that clarification if the pooling continued, if it didn't, to understand so you were in a better position to advise us. Did you seek that clarification?
When I personally didn't seek the clarification with MHCLG officials, but as Chief of Staff has indicated, the likelihood of getting clarity over these issues, particularly as Chief of Staff again has emphasised, because negotiations were actively taking place with the government, and indeed the Mayor and London Council's leader wrote to the Secretary of State before Christmas, setting out the possibility that if they were to London-wide to abandon the pooling, would the Secretary of State come in and take measures to seek to compensate London for those arrangements. Unfortunately, we received no reply to that letter, and hence the formal letter on the 12th of January that was sent to Secretary of State confirming that London-wide we were looking to abandon the arrangements for 21-22.
Now, from your point of view, David Galley, you see this as very normal and how you have acted has been completely appropriate. But do you not understand, from our point of view as the Assembly, as the scrutiny body, it looks like you are trying to hide from us this potential windfall of over £100 million and the significant impact that has had across all our discussions, across all budgets. So do you regret that you will have had a knock on the confidence of Assembly members in your role and your work? Because it really, we have to have confidence in you because you are the Finance Director for the whole of the GLA, not just the Mayor.
Well, obviously, I'm concerned if you don't have confidence in my judgments. But as I say, in my position, my professional view was that there was a material risk in the safety net threshold being set at a lower level than 97%, arising from the London-wide pooling, and that was my best professional advice. And going back to that situation again, if I would go back into hindsight, I would have made that same judgment because I still consider there is a significant risk that that safety net threshold will be at a lower level if the government looked at the detail more closely, and that is a significant risk that I think remains for London in future years.
Would you, in hindsight, perhaps have chosen to brief the Assembly on this earlier so that we had some understanding and oversight of this dilemma and this position that you were in?
I mean, there's obviously, again, is danger going into some of the private conversations that we have had at the Bureau of Leaders, but obviously, I'm happy to be invited to your meetings and have given, over the period of time in the budget preparation, informal advice and questioning, indeed, have written more formally following one of those meetings around that professional advice. So I'm always happy to do that. I say again, reiterate, that's my professional view, that was the most likely level of resources that the Mayor would have to allocate at the point of the first draft budget in January.
Okay, and Mary, finally, could I just ask you, do you regret this position that we find ourselves in as the scrutiny body? The Assembly has been kept in the dark about this information, and what changes will you put in place to ensure that we're not left in this position again should such a situation arise?
Thank you, Assembly Member Pigeon. So I think we all regret the situation that some of the Assembly Secretariat staff have been put in as a result of this. I think we'll all say that. I think David has laid out very clearly the judgments he was faced with and why he took them, and that is his job. I think, however, it would be good and David and I can talk about this, to think about, in hindsight, could a different route have been taken? And we'll reflect on that.
Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Devenish.
I was also going to ask Mary when she first became aware of this discussion.
So I became aware at the very end of January that it did indeed look as if we were going to have more money available at the GLA than I had thought possible.
So you weren't briefed in late November or any time in December or early January by Mr. Galley that there was possible good news of extra £100 million?
No, and David said that.
And do you think, as you are responsible not only for your mayoral roles, but actually for the Assembly, that you should have at least known that?
Well, as I've said to Assembly Member Pigeon, I think, I do want to review this and think through whether something different should have been done by David or myself, or if I should have been, more interventionist and asking David more. But, I am Chief Officer of the GLA. I was focused on getting the detailed budget that we have been discussing this morning ready. As I've said to staff, actually, through my all-staff briefings on the budget, I did not imagine at any point that we at the GLA would be getting more money. If anything, I was worried we were going to get less. Partly because, as we've known right from the beginning, that the mayor, in the first instance, needs to look elsewhere in the group when he has additional money to allocate. So, as far as I was concerned, none of that position had changed.
And it's important
Either mayor or
to recognise that the only reason the mayor was able to allocate additional resources to the GLA was because of A, additional council tax income that we learnt about at the end of January as those returns came in, and B, the final settlement which confirms the 97% safety net which we learnt about on 4th of February. That's when we knew that we would have additional income, and that's entirely consistent with what the mayor said in his foreword to the consultation budget back in December. We will not know how much council tax and business rate income we will receive until the end of January. And that's exactly the position that we've been in. There are any number of scenarios that could have played out that even in January were possibilities. And it's clearly David Galley's job as Secretary Chief Financial Officer to apply professional judgment and to act in accordance with the Prudential Code, which does involve being prudent. And that's what he did in his advice to the mayor, and that's what's reflected in the draft group budget. And when the information changed, clearly his advice was able to change accordingly. But
Well,
it panned out entirely on the timelines we have said it would.
Mr. Bellamy, I think the fundamental problem is that officers in this building think they only report into the mayor and you. And it's about the fundamental ability to scrutinise you. And as Nicola Sturgeon is finding out in Scotland at the moment, you are a powerful executive, but you have responsibilities to be held to accountable. And we can't hold you accountable when you don't even tell the chairman, the Budget and Performance Committee, something this fundamental. We're not saying you would have changed your recommendations, and Mr. Galley is absolutely entitled to his professional judgment. It's your secrecy again. It's the fact you are always not prepared to share information with assembly members. We are here to scrutinise you. You have the £18 billion budget. You have all the statutory power because you were democratically elected, and I accept that. But we have the responsibility to monitor you, and it's incredibly difficult because you do this time and time again.
So this is right. Let's be clear. Let's be clear about this. If we have allegations made, let's be clear about it. So absolutely, it's the responsibility of the Assembly to scrutinise the Mayor. It is the responsibility of officers to support the Mayor in his executive functions and the Assembly in his scrutiny functions. What David Galley has done and what the finance team do is support the Mayor in the development of the budget, and then they support Assembly as members and officers as required in the scrutiny process. Yeah? They don't get into discussions about executive decisions before those decisions are made and published, because that is rightly a matter for the executive, and that's how it should be.
It wasn't a decision, Mr. Bellamy. It was almost explaining what may or may not happen. And it's £100 million. It's not a pound note behind a sofa here. £100 million. At least you could have told AM Hall.
Well, that's why we set out in the budget guidance the huge range of uncertainty. At every meeting we have, I've talked in detail, as has David Galley, about the huge uncertainty we face. At any time, this committee, members of it, publicly, privately, could have chosen to ask about the safety net position if you wanted to, and there would have been an answer. You didn't.
Chair, I'll leave it there, but maybe Mr. Bellamy should look at where Mrs. Sturgeon is facing in Scotland for the same culture of secrecy.
Okay, I do agree with a lot, or virtually all of the comments from my colleague, Assembly Member Devenish. Going back to you, David Galley, I don't quite know what position you'd have been in. Supposing we had picked up on this, supposing all the people that assist us with this as well had picked up on this safety net, and supposing we questioned you on it in our 5th of January meeting, and you then had to expose the fact that we could have get an extra £100 million, what would the Mayor or your Chief of Staff have said to you, because at that point you hadn't told them? What would they have said if we'd have found out through goodness knows where, looking deeper into something, that actually that was a possibility? What would you have said to the Mayor? Oh, I was going to tell you.
Well,
I can tell you.
No, I'm asking David Galley.
I mean, Chairman, let me go back to my earlier answers to you. Following the Budget Performance Committee meeting on the 5th, then in preparation for the draft budget in January, I discussed these issues with the Chief of Staff, and that formed the basis of the budget that was put forward on the 27th of January. As I said before, in briefing the Mayor for that meeting, I discussed that directly, and I know that the Chief of Staff discussed the issues with the Mayor, so both the Mayor and the Chief of Staff would have been aware of these issues.
But there was no figure in terms of what the gain would have been on the 5th of January had you asked, because the decision hadn't been taken at that point to end the pool. And as David Galley explained a few minutes ago, whether the pool was in place, A, fundamentally determined what the impact of safety net would be on us, and B, created fundamental uncertainty about what level the government would set it at. So at that stage, there was no answer to give, either publicly in committee or privately to the Mayor, because we did not know.
Right, okay, and my colleague Caroline Pidgey wants to come back briefly on this, then we must move on. But you must understand, we are not happy with this. It's not necessarily the figure, it's the transparency or lack of. Assembly Member Pigeon.
It's transparency.
I'm now asking a question, thank you. To David Galley, I was just reflecting on what you said. You said that you hadn't personally spoken to an official in the ministry, but did any of your other staff speak to any of the officials to try to get clarity on this figure, whether it's 92.5% or 97%?
As I said, there was ongoing dialogue between my staff and MHCLG. There's very good relations between our two teams. I don't know explicitly they discussed this issue. I can inquire as to that, if that would be of assistance. And obviously,
relations, you would think you might have a word. I mean, that's how local government and government work. You would have a word just to try to get some clarity, because we're trying to finalise these figures and we're trying to advise the Mayor and the London Assembly in terms of budget setting. Did that not go ahead? It would seem normal.
As I said earlier, I mean, there's ongoing good dialogue with MHCLG, but the issue is that the civil servants are very much constrained on what they could do, because these are essentially policy decisions that their ministers will take and are only formally announced at these set piece situations of the announcements being made. So although there was dialogue, and I'm sure there would have been dialogue around this, in terms of being able to get clarity, as Chief of Staff said, it's only at the point at which we have the formal announcements that we can have the clarity and the certainty that allows then these uncertainties and risks that I've highlighted to be crystallised.
Okay, it would be interesting to know if there had been any discussions, particularly given there had been this correspondence, though I've heard clearly what you've said today about the certainty, but I would have thought that would be normal practice. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, my colleague, Assembly Member Shah, wants to come in at this point.
Chair, just a quick question, please, if I may. As it is, as you know, group secretaries have a tiny budget. What do you have to say to the staff, to Unison, as well as members, where, you know...
We're coming to the... Actually, Nabin, we're coming to this section shortly. Shall we just go through?
Okay, I'll wait. I wasn't sure, but I'll wait for that. No problem.
No, okay, and I'll definitely call you in then. I mean, yeah. To finish this tiny section, I do hope, David Galley, that you get the impression that we are not happy by this at all. It's a vast sum of money, but it's actually the principle, the fact that that sort of thing has not been put in the budget. I think we all feel very, very let down by this. And of course, you say you'll come and brief us on anything we want to know, but when we don't know something is there, you can't ask for a briefing on it. And that's the simplicity of it. I feel very, very let down. Now, given the issues experienced with the financial forecast used in the most recent budget setting process, what are the risks to the financial assumptions underlying the establishment of the new business rate repayment reserve with as high a value as 272 million?
Thank you, Chairman. I mean, the risks, as I think I indicated earlier, are endemic. They are very, very real. As the Chief of Staff has already said, there is possibilities of the material change in circumstance of certain businesses may lead to reductions in rateable values of the order of 65%, and that would clearly have a huge impact upon London and indeed nationally, because, as you will well know, Chairman, the London pays in large sums of money to the government from business rates. There is a very live and active debate that is going on in the Society of London Treasurers, and indeed is a meeting this afternoon which I will attend on this very subject. Where we are is, although the government has committed to meeting 75% of the losses in 2021 arising from business rates revaluations, the sum set aside by the Treasury at the moment is insufficient for London's estimates of these figures, never mind the figure nationally. So there is a real issue nationally as well as in London. So the sums of money that we have put into the reserve are very much based upon the difference between the returns that the boroughs have actually made, which were submitted on the basis without the change in material change of circumstance, as against their shadow returns of what they think the losses will be. So I'm anticipating that reserve will be drawn down as we get clarity on the exact scale of losses we'll incur in 2021 and the final outturn numbers from the boroughs.
Okay, do you think there should be an independent assessment of the level of the reserve?
I mean, the level of the reserve, as I say, is based upon the difference between the borough submitted NNDR1 returns and their shadow returns. So that is, I think, is the best estimate that is available to me and to London.
So you don't think there should be anything independent there?
I'm not sure what the purpose of an independent review would be, Chairman.
I think it's so somebody else with separate eyes can take a look at it. But I'll move on. We're running very late of time. Now, this touches on what my colleague, Assembly Member Shah, is going to come in on afterwards. But why did you allow the Assembly Secretariat restructure to proceed in early January 2021 based on meeting the scenario 3 savings, which for anybody watching is the most pessimistic of all your scenarios, when it became apparent that scenario 1 was the more likely to be the outcome?
Because that was not apparent. What was apparent was from council tax returns. They were received at the end of January, and I briefed leading assembly members at the start of February that they were looking better than expected. And then the business rate returns and the associated local government settlement. As discussed, the local government settlement published on the 4th of February, voted on by Parliament 10th of February. Business rate returns, whilst being statutorily due on 31st of January, in fact came in across the first 2 weeks in February. And so it was the 10th of February when Parliament took its vote that David Galley was able to advise privately members on the position that we were in terms of business rates and council tax. I don't have in front of me the date on which you decided to suspend your consultation.
So going back to David Galley, you obviously, I mean, you hadn't informed other people, but you knew. So why didn't you confidentially alert the Assembly that the situation was realistically going to improve, allowing us to revisit the timetable for restructuring proposals?
Well, there are two things I'd say to that, Chair. I mean, the first of it is to, reiterate what we've said to date, that because of the degree of uncertainty around the business rates pooling impact upon the safety net, it would not have been until the 10th of February when the House of Commons approved the final local government settlement that we'd have certainty about that level. Second point I'd make is that I did informally advise the Bureau of Leaders around the improvement in the council tax position. So in terms of when I had information that I felt was sufficiently robust, I did disclose the information to the Assembly. And as we know, the bulk of the funding source for the Assembly is around council tax rather than the impact on business rates. And so I am confident that in terms of my role here, in terms of giving professional advice, was one that I discharged fully and appropriately.
Okay, I'll ask one more question, then I'm going to bring in my colleague. You told the Mayor's Chief of Staff on the 8th of January about the improved funding position, but you didn't tell the Assembly either at the same time or before, even though this was the only directorate launching staffing consultations. Don't you see that there's an inconsistency there, Mr. Galley?
Well, I think as the Chief of Staff has indicated, it's not for me or for him to make decisions around starting your consultation arrangements. My role is to give the best financial advice I can, which I believe I did, given all the uncertainties that we had.
Well, your professional advice was very wrong at the time, which put, I think it's 28 members of staff into a position thinking that they were going to be made redundant. And yet the Mayor's staffing plans were quite different. I'm going to bring in my colleague, Assembly Member Shah now, and I'll sort of finish up at the end of it.
Chair, certainly, I mean, David Gallis mentioned his comments at the Bureau of Leaders meetings. Surely we will check the records, but whatever you look at, or however way you look at the whole issue about a safety network, the fact is that as a consequence of the entire mess, there is long-lasting damage to the staff, to Unison in their activities to support the staff as well as members. Because, we needn't have lost some of the valued staff that we have lost. Unison staff and members, we all have suffered as a consequence long-standing damage. What do you have to say to all of that? And how can you repair, if at all, the immeasurable damage that this whole process has done?
So I think, firstly, the entire authority, and indeed the entire GLA group, has and remains in a situation of great uncertainty about finance and all that flows from that. We haven't touched on this, but the GLA Mayor budget that's before us today sets out, sadly, a very significant number of job losses in the region of 40 that are going to be required as a result of this budget. And that and the prospect is very regrettable. I know this personally. We've already run a consultation exercise around restructure and redundancies in the Mayor's office, as you will know, Assembly Member. And I also personally know that I sat at this table in the previous role several years ago, working on redundancy restructure proposals that were leading me to decide which of my 3 closest colleagues were going to lose their job. So I know exactly how tough this is, and for the individuals, it is awful. The reality is we are fundamentally in this position because of the uncertainty of funding sources. It was for the government to say, no, right, we will provide you early certainty about your income for 2020-21 and 21-22. They did not do so. Indeed, as has been set out in this meeting, we still don't, 8 working days from the end of the financial year, know what our income will be for 2020-21. The only reason we're in the position, I was going to say happy position, but it's not, given the circa 40 redundancies we are looking at on the GLA Mayor side, that we're in the position we are in, where the consultation is not that you launched, you're not having to go through on, is because of the safety net being set at 97%, which, as you say, we only learnt that was the government's intention on the 4th of February, and it was confirmed by Parliament on the 10th of February, and B, the council tax returns that we received in late January. If we'd only had one of those 2 benefits, then the Mayor would have been, firstly, any business rate benefits, TfL getting their proportionate share as required with the Department for Transport, and then B, he would have prioritised, as he's made clear throughout the process, the emergency services. So it's only because of both those developments that we're in the position that we are in. The reason that, then going on to the situation you face, where the Assembly has come to me and come to officers and asked for support through this process, we've done all we can to provide it. So it was the Assembly's plan to launch this consultation process before Christmas. My feeling is that that would be an appalling thing to do, to tell staff they're at risk of redundancy before Christmas. And so we provide assurance that funding would be available so that that did not need to happen. Secondly, Assemblymember Duval rightly raised with me concerns about trying to implement some of the changes around party groups shortly before an election, which obviously the outcome of which is unknown, And again, we agreed that we would provide support there. So where support has been asked for, we have provided it.
Assemblymember Shah?
Well, David, I hear what you say, but the fact remains that the whole process has created so much of anguish, so much of anxiety, and we have lost the staff who could have carried on, and we would have wanted them to carry on and serve us. Uh, our budget is minuscule compared to the rest of it. And given the situation that we were put in, we had no option. So going forward, how can we improve the process? Because you cannot have repeat of anything like this in the future.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, it's a very good fair question to ask about, well, what can we learn? We should always look at, can we improve our processes? So when the budget guidance was launched in the summer, I offered to work collaboratively with the Assembly, work together through all these challenges to help us best manage it. Instead, what I got was an approach from Assembly Party leaders that was about sending hostile letters, asking lots of questions, tying lots of time up in correspondence. Yeah. In trying to understand the position the Assembly was in, it was difficult because the Assembly has not published any quarterly monitoring information to set out its budget position. Indeed, the final budget that you published earlier this month provides no analysis of the difference for your budget next year and this year. And this makes it very difficult. To be honest, I was at the point where I had to take legal advice to ensure that I would be able to obtain the information needed in order that the Mayor could perform his statutory functions and set a budget. This is absolutely not how I wish to work. I wish to work in a collaborative way with Assembly members. Yes, I report to the Mayor, but I'm also an officer of the authority, and I think you all know me well enough by now to know that I and the Mayor value the scrutiny function of the Assembly and believe that a strong and effective Assembly is good for the mayoralty and it's good for London. And what we as an organisation need to do, and it's true at our level, it's true of relationships between officers as well, I believe, is that we need to tear down some of these walls and some of these fears and some of these suspicions and find much better and more professional ways of working together. And that's something that I would really like to do with the new Assembly and its leading members following the election, because I think the way the Assembly, to be frank, cuts itself off from the rest of the organisation really is what is at the heart of all these problems. And I want to see really different relationships in future if I'm fortunate enough to be here following the election.
Okay, Assemblymember Shah?
Chair, there's a lot that David has said that needs to be looked at. I don't agree with quite a bit of that, but this is all going forward. I shan't be on the assemblies, but this is for the new administration to consider in full, particularly if the relationship is broken, which is effectively what David is saying. That is something that is to be looked at. And accusations about Secretary's approach, the approach of the leaders has also been challenged. All of this needs to be very seriously looked at, because if you carry on like this is in my view, and I'll stop there. I worry about members' ability, Assembly members' ability to carry on with the work that they need the duty they have to the electorates to hold mayor to account, and this is a very serious situation which needs to be addressed. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, I'm just going to pick up on a couple of things that you said, David. Firstly, the job losses you referred to, are they job losses or deletion of posts?
So we are looking at
Briefly.
circa 60 deletions of posts, but I think there are around 18 vacancies. So the balance, circa 40 I talked about, would be job losses. There are some new posts, and so hopefully some of those post holders will gain those opportunities, and so they won't ultimately be redundant. Obviously, that depends on the process and how it plays out.
Yes, I think we'll be very interested in seeing just how many redundancies, because I've seen how many new posts that you're looking at. You also said a strong and effective assembly is what you want. We can only be strong and effective when we're given all the information, and you can see quite clearly none of us believe that we were given the full information over this miraculous turning up of 100 million. I can go back to David Galley very quickly, if I may. Can you think of any other occasion, David, in your professional career at the GLA when you have withheld or delayed information of this potential magnitude from elected members? And do you think this is normal in local authorities? And have you seen it anywhere else before?
Chairman, at risk of kind of repeating what we have said.
That's a quick answer. That's a quick answer. Have you ever seen this sort of thing before?
Let me answer the question, please. Let me reiterate that my obligation was to give the best financial information about the likely situation facing the authority. And it was not until the billing authority returns and the final final settlement was made in February that we were able to give certainty around our overall financial position. Therefore, the position given in the draft budget was my best advice at that particular time, and that remains my position.
Okay, yet again, you actually haven't answered, have you? You haven't answered. There was information there that we weren't given. I've asked if you've ever seen it before, but there's been several things that you haven't answered properly today, and some of the committee I can see are getting very irritated by it. Finally, last question on this section. Why is the £1.6 million reduction of corporate savings, which constitute 14% of the total, not being replaced with other corporate savings?
Because the exercise we went through in the autumn, there at the draft budget, we were looking to drive out as many savings as we could from the core. If there were more savings there available at that point, we would have taken them. What's important to understand about the change in this area is that a big part of it is not a change in terms of how much the authority will spend. It's to drive more accurate budgeting, where the authority's previous practice of how it budgeted staffing costs was making some assumptions that were inaccurate in a number of areas and tended to leave us making greater expenditure. So what we should have now is a more accurate budget, which will enable better scrutiny and clarity on our financial position as we go through the year ahead.
Okay, I mean, it's quite clear. We know you've got professional calls to make. We know that sometimes that we may not agree with those, but it's the transparency that we have got a problem with here. The lack of transparency, which in my view this time has been absolutely unbelievable. I'm going to go on to our next.
How can you complain about transparency when you don't even publish any budget monitoring? How?
Well, I'm talking. Don't deflect this. This is what your mayor does. Don't deflect this. I'm asking questions, as is my right, as is any member's right. Ask you questions. No. You're here to answer our questions. Let's get that right straight. If you want to ask us anything else, put it in writing, and I'll make sure our director assists us with giving you an answer. Just as another point, I'd like if you can put in writing to me, please, what legal advice you got, because I'm certainly not clear what you're asking legal advice on. We haven't got sight of that. We're running very late on this meeting, so I'm now going to move on. But please, Mr. Bellamy, make sure that the committee has information on whatever you were seeking advice on, legal advice on. Right, I'm going to go over now to Assembly Member Devenish to talk about relocation of City Hall.
Thank you, Chair. If I could just make a brief comment on the previous section. I do think that after Mr. Bellamy's allegations that we've almost cut ourselves off. I think he's said. I think we should really ask Mary if she wants to comment, because obviously she's got a foot in both camps. And if he's saying that we're not providing information or we're not being transparent, when we think the cultural problems come from the mayor's side, I'd be interested in Mary's very brief take on that, please.
Thank you, Assembly Member Devenish. So I can talk from an officer perspective, and I do think there could be closer working between officers, the Assembly, and in the Assembly Secretariat and outside the Assembly Secretariat. I've thought that since I arrived, and have talked about that in my staff meetings since I've arrived. So I think there could be more that we could do to join some of this up while respecting the different roles and responsibilities of both sides.
Well, I don't think it's getting any better with respect, Mary. It seems to have got worse in the last few years. So I do think after the election, subject to any of us being back, we should redouble our efforts, because it's pretty poor. The whole culture is pretty poor. But I'll leave it there and go on to my question, which actually, again, really illustrates where we are. So I'm starting with David Galley. The subjective analysis on page 78 of the GLA Mayor budget sets out a 59% decrease in premise costs between 2021 and 21-22. Mr. Galley, how can this be when the GLA is scheduled to occupy both the existing City Hall and the Crystal during 21-22?
Thank you for your question, Member Devenish. I mean, the problem with the subjective analysis here, it reflects the one-off costs that are going through arising from the relocation, which sort of distorts the underlying position, which ends up with the overall premises cost, as you can see, I think, from the final number, but at a full year level in 22-23, which reflects the savings that we will generate from the move to City Hall to the Crystal.
It does seem really, somebody, I work in the property industry, Mr. Galley. If you achieve this, I would be very impressed, bluntly. I think your figures are, frankly, fictitious. Can you provide a breakdown, please, to the committee on how this figure has been determined, and please, a detailed breakdown?
Happy to do so. Obviously, there's been extensive correspondence that I know we've had on this subject earlier, and I'm sure we can reply on that swiftly.
Thank you. To Mary, why was the decision to proceed with the Crystal taken and justified in the light of the forecast of income, as we've just been discussing, which has turned out to be drastically misstated?
Thank you, Assembly Member Devenish. Well, as you know, we had to take this decision some months ago, linked to the break at City Hall, which we had to give notice on before Christmas. So all of the work around the move to the Crystal and the assessment of its value was done through the summer and finished with the mayoral decision published on the 3rd of November. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is, as we know, this move does save both the GLA group and the GLA itself significant money. And, my personal view is that that money is still required to be saved, given everything we've heard about the uncertainty and the reality that actually the GLA is working with a smaller budget. But the timing was way before any sense of the discussion that we've been having about business rates.
On what date did you sign the paperwork to trigger the break clause on City Hall, please, Mary?
From memory, we triggered it on the 18th of December, a week before the absolute deadline. It's the 18th or 19th of December.
You write and confirm that, please.
Yes.
Given the high level of such uncertainty on the financial planning, why were concerns raised across the Assembly and by others, including the suitability of this location, which nobody can say it's particularly situated in terms of accessibility for all Londoners. But again, I'm taking the point my colleague A.M. Buffer always makes about disabled Londoners. I think it's a location that isn't ideal for many, many Londoners. Why were these just basically dismissed out of hand?
Concerns about accessibility, Assembly Member Devlish.
Accessibility is one example, but also the economic, whilst we want to help the East London economy, and I appreciate that was one of the reasons given by the Mayor, you know, we know with COVID particularly, it is my constituency in the whole of Zone 1 and 2 that are really suffering and probably are going to suffer for quite a while. So why take away City Hall at this time? And also the whole issue of democratic accountability that we know, as we've been discussing during this, you know, if you shove the Assembly to one side, which some people fear the Mayor is doing, it isn't a great look at the beginning of a new term of office, is it?
Well, I think all the arguments and the pros and cons of moving out of City Hall to the Crystal were rehearsed in considerable detail during the process of taking the decision. The saving was a considerable influence on that decision, and you know, I certainly stand by that in terms of the savings that are required.
So
we are doing an awful lot of work.
The decision was made purely on financial grounds.
So this was a decision by the Mayor, so I probably should answer this because it's the Mayor's decision. The Mayor's decision obviously was taken considering all relevant factors as set out in the mayoral decision form and the appended documents, and it's a very comprehensive piece of work that was put together. There is no suggestion of sidelining the Assembly. In fact, the reverse is true. The Mayor will be closer to the Assembly than is the case at City Hall. And it is the Crystal will be entirely an appropriate home, and the financial savings that will be delivered are, as the Chief Officer says, significant. And it's really important to remember that whilst this year's budget did not turn out to be as bad as we feared, let's not forget this GLA Mayor budget that we're discussing today requires significant drawdown on reserves, and clearly that's not something that can be sustained forever. And if our income sources don't recover, then we have a real challenge ahead of us. We also know, don't we, that the analysis of the government's budget shows that there's a 7.5%, I think the independent analysis published yesterday was, reduction in funding for unprotected government departments, which includes local government. And we know, based on what we've learned in the last decade, the government finds it easier to cut things that are further away from it, particularly local government. And we also know this government's attitude towards London. And therefore,
I've been grateful
that we would carry on another 5 years
have the power to
incurring these significant additional extra costs would be financially unacceptable. And as the Mayor said at the time when he took the decision, that there's a very strong case, even without the financial situation that we found ourselves in.
So I almost don't know where to start. It's always back to the government, Mr. Bellamy. It's the one line that you guys always go back to. On the point of the savings, are you confident that when we review this, if we are here in a year's time, the savings you have promised will be made in terms of the move?
Yeah, the Chief Officer may want to comment on progress on the project, but from the updates I've had from her to date, it does sound like we are on track to deliver those savings, yes.
And in terms of London's recovery, do you think plopping the Assembly from where it is now, right at the centre of of London, to this location actually gives the wrong message in terms of COVID recovery for London?
To be frank, I think the location of the Assembly has virtually no impact on London's recovery.
Oh, so you're saying we're all irrelevant? Okay, I won't.
You asked about London's recovery, and that's a big question in terms of billions of pounds, and whether you hold a meeting in near London Bridge, in the Royal Docks, or we do it virtually, I don't see what impact that has on London's recovery. What matters is the quality of the discussion, not where it happens.
Well, I think I disagree with that. We'd all move to Milton Keynes, wouldn't we, for just a cost-benefit analysis, really. Great respect to Milton Keynes. Anyway, Mr. Galley, coming back to you, sir. Paragraph 6.8 of the MD 2795 seems to set out an annual reduction of 1.5 million in the savings arising from the move to the Crystal, but the wording is not very clear. Is this correct, and what led to it being the case?
Have we lost Debbie Gallo?
No, I think he's on.
I think he's looking it up.
I think you're on. There we go. You're on mute.
Sorry, apologies for the delay there. I was just looking at the paragraph number, sorry. 6.8. What we sought to do though, something with Devonish, is to balance the full year savings we anticipate from the move to Crystal with the need to repay the one-off costs that we are now incurring. So what we've done is take a balance. So we've assumed for this budget a 5 million saving, albeit ultimately, once the full year savings come through, it will be 8.2 million for the GLA alone. So what we sought to do there is take some of the benefit of the savings up front by our use of reserves, but ultimately repay the one-off costs from the savings that will arise.
Thank you. Mary, are you confident the renovation work at the Crystal will be completed on time and within budget?
Thank you. Yes, I am currently confident. The only thing I would say is we are confident because, of course, of the improving situation on the virus and allowing construction work to go ahead as planned. Should that situation deteriorate, then I think we would have to revisit our thinking on the timing, but at the moment I'm confident.
And my final question, I really wanted to go back to AM Hall and particularly AM Shah's brilliant points. The morale of the organisation, effectively. They didn't quite put it that way because AM Shah's far too diplomatic. But it is about the morale of the organisation. Basically, we've been through COVID. Everybody's pulled together. It's been a really tough time for everybody in the organisation, London, the country, the world, etc. You then scared the living daylights out of everybody by having these redundancies which weren't necessary, process gone through and then stopped. We are losing good staff for scrutiny. I'm interested in our side of the Assembly, but also indeed of the Mayor's staff. How do you think morale is as we're trying now to move the staff to a completely different location, which, as you know, one of the first things we all look at when we take a job, perhaps not Assembly members, but everybody else, is where is it located? How can I get home easily at night to my family, my kids, my social life, etc.? How do you think they're all feeling after being kept in the dark like this and then having this foisted on them by the Mayor? Mary.
So I'm going to take a couple of those points in turn. So in terms of staff morale, broadly across the whole organisation, I think it is as good as we could expect, given, as you say, the year we have been through. And in fact, I hosted a digital conference for our 150 so most senior managers just on Wednesday. We meet every 6 months. And I think both myself and the rest of the corporate management team were frankly flabbergasted and amazed and delighted with the level of energy and willingness among that group to now, come out of this grueling year we've had and into a new year of delivery. It was quite astonishing. I accept that the Assembly Secretariat staff who have been through this process and then we've all just been discussing are probably not feeling energised and excited, but I am actually meeting with them all next week. I have offered to meet with them directly and I'm doing that. On the move, I think there are, as you would expect, mixed feelings about the move. I think people are waiting to understand more detail about what it's actually going to mean. You know, I'm still talking to staff about who's anchored where. I think the thing that is most on people's minds is how are we going to move now from a almost, we're all one, none of us are in City Hall as we speak now, are we? None of us. How are we going to move from a fully remote model of working to a mixed model that works not only for us, the GLA as an organisation, but also for teams and for individuals. And that's the matter in hand now, and that's the matter that people actually are excited about in terms of the managers, but also concerned about. And that's my job over the next 3 months. So we get up to a position where we're all feeling we know how this is going to be and we are looking forward to it. But I have to say, Assemblymember Devenish, I was surprised and taken aback by the high level of morale I found, certainly in our top 150 staff just this week.
Could I ask you to write to me with metrics in terms of staff morale, because there are customer surveys done in the organisation. I'd be very interested to see those, even if you have to send them to us privately, and also the attrition rate that you're expecting in the City Hall team from where it is now, virtually obviously, to where it's moving to, because I predict, and I've seen this in many organisations, public and private, your attrition rate is going to go off a cliff in terms of people leaving the organisation. So I'd love to see what you're going to be measuring. Anyway, I wish all the staff well. They've done a great job during a very tough period, Chair, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I think we can all agree on that. Assemblymember Devenish, one very quick question, Mary. You signed the break clause thing on the 18th of December. You said that earlier, didn't you? Yes. That's the day after the local government settlement came through, which David Galley didn't share with you. Not very joined up thinking, is it?
Well, my focus, remember, was on we had to give notice by Christmas Eve. I'd had to wait for planning permission, which I'd then had. We'd signed the Section 106 agreement, I can't remember, 2 or 3 days before that. I didn't want to leave it till Christmas Eve to be serving notice on our landlord. So that was my choice. It was a Thursday or Friday. I wanted it done before that weekend, before Christmas.
You wouldn't have been told anyway of what was coming down the line. Right, we're going to move on now to the next section. My colleague, Assembly Member Pigeon, is going to take this one.
Thank you, Chair. And I think the discussion, though it's been tense at times, actually has been quite revealing this morning. And I do look forward, if I'm re-elected with colleagues, to finding a very constructive way to work going forward and to iron out some of the issues so that we're all being transparent. So please take that on board as it's meant. I want to ask about some staffing issues. I'm going to go general and then I've got a very specific issue I wanted to go into. I don't know whether this is for Mary or David, but there's a revenue savings target of £10 million for the GLA Mayor budget for the next financial year. But how meaningful is that when it's set against projected underspends of 92 million in revenue and 752 million in capital for the same year? David, would David be best to answer that? David Galley?
I think David to start, perhaps. That's okay with you, David.
And the next questions I'll bring to you, Mary. David.
Sure. So going back to the Q3 analysis, which I think, Caroline, is where your figures are coming from. The key things around the variance on revenue, the 93 million, reflect a number of one-off items. I mean, just to go through the list here and highlight the main ones. So postponed action has cost us 13 million in slippage. The lower learner enrolments on AEB courses has cost us over 15 million. The management of rough sleeping referred to earlier across financial years has cost us 14 million. And the delays in making payments to the Museum of London and area development is 16 million. So it's a series of one-off items that have driven the principal elements of that revenue underspend, which are related to COVID. But what I would say, and buried deep in the detail of the budget paper, is a real attempt to kind of grapple with some of the issues that you've highlighted around slippage, and also on salaries, where we are seeking to improve our processes in the way that we budget for staffing, but also how we look to manage levels of slippage, which is perhaps inevitable to a certain degree on capital programs in particular. So we have devised a new method of accounting for carry forwards, but also now budgeting at an actual level of staff costs rather than previously a theoretical level, which included a vacancy factor. So I would hope that as things return to some form of new normal, the pandemic ceases to have the impact it's having, that these new processes will actually improve our ability to spend in line with budget and not have the scale of variances that you've highlighted.
That sounds reassuring, the new systems you're putting in place. So the 10 million revenue savings target is, you're saying, because the underspends actually are these one-off unique circumstances?
Well, I'm confident about the 10 million, more around the level of detail that's set out in the budget, not least of which, of course, going back to the crystal for a moment, is the 5 million. And that, I think, shows how important the relocation is to the generation of savings in core. Effectively, it's delivering half of the core savings. But there's levels of detail set out in the budget paper that sets out the detail behind how we are delivering those that extra 5 million, which is the non-relocation savings, and they are real things. There is real difficulty and pain and agony that we've gone through in delivering those levels of savings, that they're not related to the salaries underspend as such.
Okay, thank you for that. Mary, can I just go into a little bit of detail? So the analysis on page 78 of the GLA Mayor budget sets out a 3.6% increase in staffing costs from the year 2020-21 to the next financial year. Yet the establishment is going down, I think, by just over 1%. Is this due to a different approach to budgeting for posts? What lies behind this? Can you clarify it for us, please? If you can't, let's put it in writing. You're mute, Mary.
Sorry, that was my on mute again face. So it relates directly to the way we are now treating the staffing budgets. So as David said, past practice, which again, when I arrived, I found somewhat surprising, was to use something of a theoretical model for the staffing budgets, assumes everybody's on the mid-grade, etc., which of course at team level isn't true. So we've moved, as David Galley has just said, to a system that far better reflects the actual costs. And that's what you are seeing reflected in that, what looks like increase. It's a much more visible, transparent view of our true staffing costs.
Reality rather than some other figure that we used in the past. That makes sense.
To be transparent, can I just add, because there are two other factors there. One is that this is gross, and so it reflects the funding for external posts, and because there are more externally funded posts planned, that leads to growth. And then the other thing, of course, is that obviously, overwhelmingly, most posts in the organisation are continuing to exist, and under the GLA's pay arrangements, most of those post holders within their grade and receive an increment, every year, and so there's the impact as that as well. So it's a range of factors that drive that, with a partial offset from the net reduction in GLA funded posts, as we've talked about already.
Lovely, thank you, that's very helpful. And then the most recent workforce report presented to Oversight Committee in January revealed that the GLA's headcount had increased by 11% full-time equivalent, sort of year on year. I know we've had a lot of externally funded posts, particularly around fire safety and so on, so I don't know if that accounts it, but perhaps Mary, if you could clarify that. And then just following on from that, we've also seen that the GLA was carrying 176 full-time equivalent vacancies as of end of September. Budget has a net deletion of 14 full-time equivalent posts. So are there likely to be any redundancies, or are we actually looking at sort of a major recruitment programme to fill these posts? Can you give us a bit of an overview there, please?
Yeah. So the things, so we do have an establishment at the end of, in a few days' time, at the end of 2021, that is a little bit higher than we had thought it would be. And there are three main reasons for that. The first reason is the creation of, in fact, it's now 25 posts related to building safety. Because of the Waking Watch posts, of course, that were approved at Oversight a couple of weeks ago. We've got an elections team, of course, who shouldn't be with us anymore, but still are for a few more weeks. So that's a team that we thought would be gone, but is still with us. We have had some new, mainly fixed-term posts related to COVID response. And recovery, and not all of those funded by us, of course, but those have kept the headcount or the establishment number up. And as ever, we get unexpected external posts, growth in external posts that we can't always see coming. And again, as Oversight saw, I've extended now 18 externally funded fixed-term posts, for which the teams now have the money, but didn't think they would have at the end of March. So that has kept the established numbers higher than we had anticipated. That's the first thing. The second thing is, so we are still carrying significant number of vacancies. I mean, I'm getting quite a lot of criticism, quite rightly, from staff for having held my line on carrying quite a lot of vacancies in the last half of this year. Again, all linked to uncertainty about funding. So we have got some significant number of vacancies still. However, people are going to be displaced from jobs as a result of our budget. So there are 60 jobs being removed from the establishment on the GLA funded side. About 20 of them, 18 to 20 of them are vacant. But there are 40 people sitting in posts that are going to be removed from the establishment. I am hoping, and I've said this really clearly to all staff, that that we avoid, if we possibly can, any of that resulting in compulsory redundancies. So we've got vacancies for people to apply to. We've got new posts being created for people to apply to, and we've got a decent redeployment policy that we are going to work. We've already made sure that across the organisation we will absolutely deploy to the letter. So it might be that we agree some people to take perhaps voluntary redundancy, but we are trying to avoid compulsory redundancy, absolute last resort. That's where we are. But it doesn't get away from the fact that there are people sitting in jobs at the moment, and those jobs won't exist coming out of consultation on a number of restructures.
Thank you. That's very clear. Thank you. Now, I wanted to go into a specific line in the budget. I don't know if it might be David Galley who can help get some clarity on this for me. And I'm particularly wanting to look at the change that was made where the support staff for the executive directors and the mayoral appointees have been merged into one, which I wasn't happy with. I felt there was a conflict there, but that's gone ahead. And that budget line has moved from the mayor's office into the core GLA. So in Appendix B, Directorate Budgets, the private office and correspondence budget of the mayor's office is reducing from 609,000 this financial year to 465,000 in subsequent financial years. So it's a reduction of 144,000. Is this directly related to that business support staff moving into the chief officer's budget?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. No, that's fine. I just wanted to clarify. I've been trawling over
Other little bits and pieces, but yes.
Yes, it's the 136. That's fine. Okay. And then, so I understand the moving of this support function is going to see a reduction in costs in the mayor's office. But then when I look across all the other spending in the mayor's office, is it correct, as it appears to be outlined in Appendix B, that there will be a 69,000 gross increase or 39,000 net increase for the mayor's office in future years?
So it's complicated is the honest answer. The budget doesn't assume any growth in headcount in the mayor's office, nor does it assume any additional non-staff spend. There are probably two facts at play. One would be what we talked about a minute ago in terms of increments, and there will be staff in mayor's office and just their pay will just go up through the authority's usual processes. The other thing is, it's fair, and I wrote to the chair of the assembly, the mayor wrote to the chair of the assembly about this following the draft budget session. We've winkled out one or two issues in kind of historic mayor's office budgets, and so hopefully the view that we're presenting going forward, which now I've had David Galley review for me, is much more of an accurate one.
Okay, so what I don't understand is if this new team is now in the core GLA and it comes to a total cost of, and I'm trying to find it, it's over 400,000, isn't it, the cost of that support team, and that's now in Mary's budget. So why do your numbers still go up when you've had a huge amount taken out? Because that resource is now not a line in your budget, it's a line in Mary's budget. Does that not mean there's more of an increase?
Because there was an error in the budget for this year, which missed the international team within the mayor's office, and this is one of the things that David Galley uncovered when he did that review, because I saw the numbers just at some point before Christmas and I thought they were wrong, and so I asked David Galley to review it for me, and he took a detailed look through and covered a few things, the most significant of which was that the international team in the mayor's office, who maintain relations with cities around the world and the Foreign Office and so forth, were omitted from the budget.
Okay, it would be helpful if we could get something in writing really showing us this, because clearly that is an issue. If you had something that was included in your budget that shouldn't have been, that makes sense because it's a core or corporate GLA function rather than a mayoral office. But equally, these posts are still part of the mayor's office, but they're now under Mary's budget. And so how is that going to be presented so we can very accurately see what the spend is on the mayor as opposed to the wider GLA?
Okay, so on your first point, as I say, the mayor wrote to the chair of the assembly on various points from the draft budget plenary, which included this issue. So
I hadn't seen it.
Perhaps if you want to review that, and if there's further questions, then obviously please let us know, and happy to answer them. the point is that this change obviously is designed to generate both cost savings and a more efficient and effective service. It has to sit somewhere. Mary's view, which I support, is it makes more sense to sit with the corporate management team, because essentially it is a corporate service that will be provided to whoever, whichever mayoral administration there happens to be. And that really builds into the point, which is the answer to your question, which is that all the staff in the GLA Mayor budget support the work of the Mayor, whether that's a PA who supports the Deputy Mayor, whether that's a security guard, whether that's a policy officer in the environment team, whoever it may be, they all support the work of the Mayor. And we, if I'm honest, sometimes there's a little more focus on what is in or out of the Mayor's office, rather than actually, really what actually matters is the totality and the effectiveness of the GLA Mayor overall as an administration.
Okay, what I'm just thinking about is the Mayor's office and what is spent directly on the Mayor rather than the wider GLA, though I understand the point you're making, but when you are looking at, and we're still looking at 400,000 cuts to the Assembly Secretariat over the year coming forward, and we've had lots of figures that we all dispute between each other on how much is spent on the Mayor's personal staffing and how much is spent on the Assembly's staffing and work. And I just think there should be something that shows that half of these staff actually are providing support to mayoral appointees. And I think it would be, I realise it's all about accounting, but I do think there needs to be some narrative to be very clear. This is what is spent supporting the Mayor and his deputies and his inner team, as opposed to the GLA officers as a wider body. But if I leave that point there, maybe we could come back to that as part of this discussion we're going to have about how we work better together and transparency. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Assembly Member Pidgeon. I must say, I'm sure we all agree with that. Very good point. Now, we've left the best till last, the gripping section on interest receipts. And the lucky person to be asking questions on that is Assembly Member Moore.
Thank you very much, Chair, and what a way to go out. Three fairly straightforward questions on interest receipts. So all three to David Galley. Given that just over £20 million of income is expected from interest receipts in 2021, is it really feasible that interest receipts will be less than half that at 9 million for 21-22?
Thank you, Dr. Moore, and I have to say it's probably my specialist subject, so I'm delighted you've asked these questions. Yeah, the answer is very much so. I mean, although the GLA's cash balances remain very strong, with interest rates now at 10 basis point, 0.1 of a rate, interest rate, you don't earn very much even if you've got large cash balances, and that reflects the reduction we've had to make on that assumption on income. What we have is a set of very good deals that we've made over a longer period of time when rates were higher, which are unwinding. So we've been able to maintain the levels of interest in this financial year, but they won't be sustainable into 21-22.
Okay, because I mean, I've encountered this in the past with my council hat on, and I'm just conscious that there is an element of windfall in some of this. So just extending that a little, do the recent year's budgets not indicate that the budget for interest receipts is often set too low, including 2019-20, for which income exceeded the budget by just under 23 million? So, I mean, do we think that things have so fundamentally changed and won't change the other way during the year that you are having to be extra prudent about it this year?
I've pressed very hard on this, as you might imagine, because clearly the loss of that scale of income has had, a dramatic impact upon the resources that we have available. Hence, the reductions we've had to make. So this has been under, really heavy scrutiny, and I've very much kicked the tires because, as you rightly point out, in the past we have had levels of income that have exceeded the budget. What we are looking to do, though, as part of the reserves creation here, is because interest on balances is strong in this year, we'll look to create a interest rate volatility reserve where the surplus from this year will be earmarked as a buffer, not only to ensure that the 9 million we've now assumed is deliverable, because actually that is a very difficult target. I wouldn't underestimate how difficult it's going to achieve even that level of income. So it's a buffer if that things get worse or our predictions aren't quite as coming in as they should be. But also, as you say, it helps establish the principle that when the sun shines, then you mend the roof, and when it pours, you've got it all prepared for, so that we can actually have a means of easing out, managing the ups and downs that will inevitably occur on this budget.
That I understand. That sounds sensible, because I mean, in the past, elsewhere, windfall has gone into a reserve, a smoothing reserve in that context. But you mentioned reserves, and so there is a question about why the 21-22 budget for interest receipts has not been updated to reflect the fact that there is now additional GLA mayoral reserves of 2.72 million to cover the future business rate losses, which are to be held during at least a good part of 21-22, and hence, even if interest rates are not good, it will generate some additional interest during the year.
Well, that's absolutely right. I think the issue goes back to my answer to your first question. Yeah, that 270 is nice to be held, and it's obviously unclear quite exactly when that will have to be repaid during 21-22, and clearly we will earn interest on that. But interest at 10 basis points doesn't really make a dent in the overall pounds million figure we've assumed.
And are you horizon scanning in the context of there are all sorts of views about what might happen over the next year in terms of interest rates? How good is your horizon scanning on that?
Well, it'd be great to have a crystal ball on these things, but the estimates that seem to be emerging from the Bank of England, and I guess ultimately also driven from the Federal Reserve, are that interest rates are unlikely to move in any significant fashion upwards really until 23. So I think certainly for 21-22 budget, I think the number we've got in there is as I say, challenging already, never mind actually thinking it actually is going to generate a surplus at some later point. But obviously we monitor this very closely.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll leave it there, Chair, and thank you, David.
Thank you very much. David, your eyes lit up, and I'm not sure whether it was the fact that it was interest receipts or whether it was that we were coming to the end of the meeting. Either way, I take it. You look a lot happier, so I'm pleased about that.
Interest receipts, Chair.
I think it might be.
It is a bit of an Anaraki game at the end of the day, but it is, it's an important one as part of those large budgets.
It is. Well, I wouldn't say that, obviously. If you want to call yourself an anorak, that's fine. I won't go there. But
I'm afraid I got a bit of a reputation during the Iceland phase in Barnet for being a real anorak about that set of stuff.
Good Lord. Well, there you are. You and David Galley have got something definitely in common there, which is nice that some people have. And it's good that we all find different things interesting, isn't it? Anyway, I have found today's conversation and questions interesting. Thank you very much. This brings us to today's, I will thank my guests first. Can I thank all our guests for attending today and for their answers to our questions? Colleagues, can we note the report and discussion? Can we agree?
Noted.
Noted.
Thank you very much. Can we agree to delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group leaders and Caroline Pigeon to agree output from today's meeting?
Agreed.
Thank you. Can we note the monitoring reports for Q3 of 2021?
Noted.
Thank you. And can we note the report on section 8?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we also note the mayor's decision lists?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Can we note the mayor's capital spending plan 2021-22?
Noted.
Thank you. And the date of the London Assembly's annual meeting due to take place on the 14th of May 2021 will decide which committees to establish on the 2021-22 Assembly year and a timetable of meetings for those committees. Now, before you go, I have to point out that this is the very last meeting of this term, and I think that a couple of thanks are absolutely required here. First of all, Bowtie Steve and your colleagues, you have really worked through a very difficult year, keeping us connected. We're really very grateful. This committee has been very busy in the last 6 months. Gino Brand, you know you're my hero. Thank you very much. And you've been ably assisted by Tom Middleton. Fiona Bywaters is been clerking for us. Fiona is an absolute delight. Thank you, Fiona. You've been really helpful. Now, none of us would get by without help from our officers. So, officers, can I say thank you to Carl Hindman, Andre Frizz, and Martin Morris. And from me, a particular thank you to Dave Mercier. He's walked me through numerous very complicated briefings so that I can make sense of them. Thank you so much, David. And of course, finally, my colleagues, you have been a wonderful committee. You have put up with hours of discussion on complex matters. I'd like to thank all of you, and thank you everyone for attending today.
Thank you, Chair.
Meeting to an end.
We thank you, Chair, for your chairmanship since you've taken over the committee. I think you've done a lot of good work in difficult remote times, so thank you.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
GLA Chamber Sound. 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 GLA Chamber Sound.